The Defense Advisory Committee held a public meeting on sexual assault in the military, with speakers including a former U.S. Air Force senior airman who talked about her assault and rape by an Air Force non-commissioned officer. The Defense Advisory Committee was created by Congress last year to give advice on the investigation and prosecution of sexual misconduct in the military. This is Half an Hour.
Good afternoon. I'm Dwight Sullivan. I'm the designated federal officer of the Defense Advisory Committee on the investigation, prosecution, and defense of sexual assault in the armed forces. This meeting of the committee is open. If a member of the audience would like to comment on any issue before the committee, please direct your request to the committee's staff director, Captain Tammy Tideswell, who is seated to my right. All public comments will be heard at the end of the meeting and at the discretion of the chair. It would be inappropriate for any member of the public gallery to offer oral comments at any other time. Written public comments may always be submitted for the committee's consideration. Ms. Bashford, the chair is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Good afternoon, all. I would like to welcome the members, participants, and everyone in attendance today to the fourth meeting of the Defense Advisory Committee on Investigation, Prosecution, and Defense of Sexual Assault in the Armed Forces, or DAC-IPAD. The Secretary of Defense appointed 16 members to the committee, all of whom are participating here today. The DAC-IPAD was created by the Secretary of Defense in accordance with the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2015 as amended. Our mandate is to advise the Secretary of Defense on the investigation, prosecution, and defense of allegations of sexual assault and other sexual misconduct involving members of the armed forces. Before we get started today, I would like to recognize and introduce the new Deputy Staff Director of the DAC-IPAD, Army Colonel Stephen Ware. Could you stand up, please, so everybody can see you? Thank you. Colonel Ware comes to us from Newport, Rhode Island, where he led the Defense Institute of International Legal Studies for the past 3 years. Colonel Ware has significant experience in military justice. He has served as a staff judge advocate multiple times, as a chief of military justice, as a defense and senior defense counsel, and as a trial counsel. Welcome, Steve, and we are delighted to have you here with us. Please note today's meeting is being transcribed, and the complete written transcript will be posted on the DAC-IPAD website at https://dacipad.whs.mil. The written materials provided to the committee members in preparation for the meeting are also available on the DAC-IPAD website. Next, I would like to recognize and introduce our military service representatives who will assist the committee with any policy questions that might arise during our discussions. Could you please stand and just identify yourselves for the benefit of the committee and the members of the public? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lieutenant Colonel Margona. I am the Army representative.
I'm Jim Martinson. I'm the Navy representative.
Good afternoon, Major Wayne Shue. I'm the U.S. Marine Corps representative.
Hey, good afternoon. I'm Captain Joe Allers, United States Air Force.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to reiterate what Mr. Sullivan said. Each public meeting of the DAC-IPAD includes a period of time for public comment. The committee has received no request for public comment for today's meeting. And again, if a member of the audience would like to comment on an issue, please direct your questions to our staff director, Captain Tammy Tideswell. There. All public comments will be heard at the end of the meeting and at the discretion of the chair. We'll begin today's meeting with an important reminder of why we are all here as we listen to the testimony of a courageous former Air Force senior airman and sexual assault survivor about her unfortunate experience and how it has affected her life. Next, we will turn our focus to the issue of the military's expedited transfer policy for service members who make an unrestricted report of sexual assault. Representatives from the Department of Defense and the military services will explain their policies and procedures and how they have been implemented to date. After that, we will hear perspectives from Special Victims Counsel and Victims Legal Counsel from each of the services about the Victims Counsel program and how the expedited transfer policy is working in practice. This meeting will continue tomorrow morning at 8:45 in this location. The focus of tomorrow's meeting will be on the legal and sexual assault response training received by commanders, as well as their experience in handling sexual assault allegations and expedited transfer requests. Thank you very much for joining us today. We are ready to begin the meeting, and I would like to welcome Ms. Hannah Stolberg. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your experiences, and we are honored to hear from you.
I'm sorry, it'll take me just a second to get a little situated here. I'm a little...
Take your time.
I'd like to begin by letting you all know that I'm so humbled and honored that you would have me here today to share this with you. And I ask that you bear with me. I'm very nervous. I have some word recall issues, so there might be some pauses. And it's just me trying to figure out what word decided to leave my head. I also deflect emotion with humor, so please don't be offended by anything I say if I crack some jokes in there. It's either crack some jokes or you can watch me lay in the fetal position and cry. So humor's better. Thank you. Good afternoon. I am retired Senior Airman Hannah Stolberg. I was a 6COX1, which is the AFSC code for nerd, also known as a contracting specialist in the Air Force. Sorry, let me take a moment.
Take all the time you want.
Thank you, ma'am. I was medically retired, thank you, in May of last year. And I think what's shocking to some people is that I never even deployed. My scariest encounters were TDYs to places like California, Maryland, with a population of I think like 7 people at the time, as well as Wright-Patt Air Force Base and even Offutt. So I really didn't do anything that was that intensive. I was reached back for contingency construction in San Antonio, Texas. But in 2012, I was raped and beaten almost to death by an Air Force NCO. I spent almost 2 days in and out of consciousness on a concrete floor. It was over Columbus Day weekend, and when I didn't show up to work, no one even came to check on me. During the assault, my right shoulder was dislocated, my left femur was fractured, damage was done to my spine, and I didn't find out for almost 1.5 years that I had received a traumatic brain injury. When I reported this to my command to try to get help, I was pulled into my commander's office with my commander and my superintendent, who was also our acting first sergeant, because we were a small squadron, and told that sometimes it's better to just embrace the suck. I was told that nothing would be done, and it was conveyed that there wouldn't be any help on that front. My superintendent didn't say anything, but his silence was his agreement. He didn't question what my commander said. We just went along with it. This led to me trying very hard to suck it up. I didn't find out my femur was fractured for 4 months. I ran on it the entire time until it almost shattered. Every time I went to the doctor, they told me that I was just running too much, and it wasn't until a major realized that something was really wrong and sent me for a bone scan that they realized the damage that had been done. On my commander's part, it wasn't handled well. But what I like to point out is that oftentimes we don't give the necessary training to those in charge in order to give them the tools on how to deal with someone in this kind of situation. And I'm very humbled to let you all know that about 2 years after this had happened was when a lot of the scandal was coming out of Lackland. And I remember our trainings on sexual assault increased. A lot more awareness was going on. And I was pulled to the side by that same superintendent and acting first sergeant. And he said, Airman Stolberg, we handled your situation wrong. What can I do to support you? What can I do to fix that? And I like to point that out because as a senior master sergeant, he had no real reason to stick up for me at that point 2 years later and put himself on the line, but he was willing to put his stripes and his reputation on the line for a senior airman who was going through a medical board and would be medically retired. And I think that that's really important to talk about the character of someone who has so much humility to come back and correct and address something that's been handled wrong. And in the aspect of what happened with him, it was truly lack of training and lack of even knowing how to deal with this kind of situation, as he'd never encountered it before. During my recovery process was not very smooth. I spent time inpatient at an intensive in an intensive program for PTSD. And there, I was in a unit with all military members, both from combat and from MST. And I met women and men from all branches who had experienced military sexual assault, military sexual trauma, and it was resounding across the board that the way that the situations were being handled was not very well. I was pulled out of this program despite me saying that I didn't really think I was ready. And the following day I was given an EPR by my command, by my superintendent, my supervisor, and they told me that although I may have outperformed my peers because I was impatient and unable to work, and the new EPR system that came out, I would be docked to a 4 because there weren't enough 5s to go around, and I had been absent to be impatient. This was on my birthday, and they took me to lunch and gave me a cake and had me sign my EPR, and I went home and attempted suicide. Obviously, it didn't work. I'm still here. The saving grace was that I didn't have access to a firearm at the time. And so I just went home and I found every pill I could possibly take. The turning point for me was when I got involved with my branch's Air Force Wounded Warrior program. A DOTI was put out for all the branches to create their own. The Army's is the WTU. I'm not really sure the other ones. But I became involved in this program at the very end of my time active duty. They took me out they wanted to take me out to an adaptive sports camp. And my command said that I could go if I forfeit my 15 days of permissive TDY upon retirement to go to this week-long camp. And I thought, sure, it's at the beach, and I don't remember being at the beach. It was in Florida. And I went. And that was the turning point for me. I was taught that things that I didn't think I could overcome, I could. I used to run, believe it or not, despite my physique now. I used to run quite a bit and loved it. And not being able to run anymore was pretty devastating to me. But at that camp, they put me in a racing chair, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt the wind fly past my helmet hair. And every sport that they gave me from then on out helped me grow and helped me claim back some of that confidence. In the program, I was also linked up with the mentorship aspect of the program and was given a mentor who's been an incredible help to my recovery as well. And finally, the aspect that has helped the most is the ambassador program, where I was taught to hopefully somewhat convey my story as I heal, and that's where Chief Master Sergeant Kinley heard me speak at a briefing and asked me to attend. It was the support like this that helped me grow, and that helped me recover. And I think that that's important to point out, is that the programs that have been put in place can be very effective and can be very helpful, as long as there's not pushback from command to be involved in them. I've spoken on several occasions, although not to this kind of room, so so I apologize for my nerves. And I can remember the first time I heard someone speak about how they had been assaulted, and it made an impact on me, because when you're in this position, you know that others are out there, but there's such a stigma of shame surrounding it that no one speaks about it. You just know that there's other people floating out there, and you never know who. And I can remember hearing someone speak on it, and I went up to him afterwards, and I can remember saying, "Me too." If any of you are on social media, you probably saw a trend happening this week of people posting the hashtag Me Too. And I thought, what a mantra. I didn't realize that this was these were the two international words for people like us who have been through this. I have yet to speak anywhere to any crowd and not be approached afterwards, and usually in a hushed whisper, in a hushed tone, be told, "Me too, me too." The impact that more visibility by people who have already been through a trauma and are recovering is something that can't really be ignored. When you know you have someone who's been in that same position, you find strength in it. I'm still learning to find my voice. I hate public speaking, and this is an uncomfortable subject. But I remember being silenced, and the pain and the absolute isolation that it brings. And so even if my voice is just a whisper right now, I'm very humbled and thankful that you've listened to me. I'm very humbled and thankful that you would take these steps to try to protect and enforce better laws so that in the future, things like this hopefully won't happen as much. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Stolberg, I do have one question for you, if you don't mind. How long was it before, from your attack until you were able to get to that program that was on the beach that you found very helpful?
So the program has different, it's one of those words that's escaping me. 1 second. The program has different camps that go around each region in the U.S. I didn't go to my first one until April of 2016. My assault happened in 2012. Thank you. And my MEB started in, it's a good question, 2014 is when my MEB officially started. So it took a couple of years, but I will say that there's been strides made to catch people sooner, as soon as they start the MEB process. And I'm not sure about the other branches, but I at least know that on the Air Force side, they've had a huge uptick in enrollment because they've been able to catch people faster than at the end. I think that had I been able to get into a program like this sooner, I might not be quite in the state that I am today. I think my recovery would have been faster and better, and not quite so rocky. But I've also seen that on the side of the way that sexual assault is handled in general, at least on the Air Force side. I was saying earlier that I think that if what happened to me today and not in 2012, it would be handled vastly different. And for that, I'm very thankful that strides are still being made to make this situation better and better. Did that adequately? Okay.
Airman Stolberg, good to see you again. When you got out of the hospital and you went back to the unit, how were you integrated back into the unit, and what kind of jobs did they give you?
It sort of depended. I had multiple surgeries. I've had 2 surgeries on my shoulder and 2 on my femur to reconstruct. And then, of course, my stay inpatient. I like to say that when you treat someone like a monster, they become a monster. And in general, when this news kind of came out and they didn't really know what to do with me, they just sort of squirreled me away in a cube and gave me some random stuff to do. I took pride in my job. I wasn't going to win like Airman of the Year, but I was very good at my job. I took pride in what I did, and my work definitely suffered afterwards. Part of it was undiagnosed PTSD and TBI, but definitely part of it was just the total lack of support and not really understanding how to go about getting help anymore. So I think it's important to still engage with your members, especially if they can still carry out the mission and the taskings. To be reduced to almost nothing was definitely one of the key factors in me attempting to take my own life. I had been stripped of my dignity, of my job, of my profession, and of my blue, of my Air Force blue, of my family. And to kind of be squirreled away and kept in secret certainly didn't help.
From your perspective, I know what happened to you happened in 2012, but as you've seen, as you've been speaking out and talking to people, where do you see the biggest need for improvement?
I am devastated to say that at least half of the people I talked to never reported anything. They're not going to be in your statistics, not even in your restricted reports. They're silent, and they've been silenced. I've talked to many people who have been in the same kind of situation where I have, where they've reached out and tried to get help, and they were silenced. I've even met people who weren't the victim, but knew the victim and spoke out, and they almost lost their life because of it, and nothing was done. I have encountered both men and women. The numbers are shocking, that either didn't report at all or nothing ever really came of it. And I understand that it's very difficult to prosecute at times. But a lot of times the way that it's handled there at the beginning could be the key between going to a trial or not. For me, when I was finally diagnosed with a TBI, they said, "Oh, we could have done more for you if you'd come in 24 to 48 hours after this had happened." And 24 to 48 hours, I was still lying on a concrete floor with no one even looking for me. One of the biggest disconnects is between leadership, and I don't think it's malicious. I think it's just a lack of training and ignorance to what to do in this situation. It's still so stigmatized that even commanders don't know what to do when you bring up the fact.
First of all, thank you so much for being here. Just your courage to be here in front of this committee, and your courage since 2012. I guess the investigative side, I mean, part of the task of this particular committee is to look at the review process for cases that are investigated by the military. And so I don't know any of the background of the investigative process, or whether there was one, and what your perspective is on that particular process in your case.
Okay, so when I was trying to, there's different avenues you could take, as we all know, and I took the avenue of reporting to my command. And when I was shut down and it was made known that I wasn't going to be receiving, they weren't going to have my back, I ended up, after doing quite a bit of research and looking into just trends in how things go to trial, the percentage of people who things are even prosecuted, and then the percentage of action that's taken even from then, and then to look at, especially in the military, you see it come out in the base letters all the time. Someone drove drunk and they've been stripped of everything and kicked out of the Air Force, but someone assaults someone and they go in for like a month. They have reduced pay for 9 months. Is that what my dignity was worth? Is that what my life is worth? And I see that from so many other people around me. For that reason, I chose to report restricted, knowing that I literally had no one to support me. I'm very sorry.
Could I ask a question?
Yes, ma'am.
I join the others in thanking you for your courage. Did anything happen to either the man who assaulted you or those higher ups that it did not do anything to help you?
Nothing happened with the man who assaulted me. As for my commander, because I was having such a hard time at work, I was assigned to help put together his retirement ceremony, and then he sat catty-cornered to me as a GS civilian for 1.5 years. That's what happened to him.
Hannah, is the Air Force, so at some point did you unrestrict your report?
I have not.
Okay.
I'm just speaking. And at this point, when I speak, especially to other wounded warriors who have been in career fields that are much more intense than mine, they tend to want to say, where is this guy? We're going to go get him. You didn't have justice. Let's bring justice. And for me, I say, someone told me yesterday that there's different kinds of justice. At this point, I am 5 years out. I've been through one heck of a mental health ride. And as I'm sure you can kind of notice, I'm not exactly rock solid on the mental health aspect. So for me, this is my justice. My justice is trying to be a voice for those who are still silenced. My justice is speaking out against this.
Well, thank you for doing that, and you're doing it very eloquently.
Thank you, ma'am.
Stolberg, I don't have a question. I just want to, you noted as you were speaking to us that you're still trying to find your voice. I just want to acknowledge you found it. I know you have places you still want to go, but it's a beautiful, strong thing. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Well, thank you so much for coming and sharing your experience. It's been very moving for all of us.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for having me.
Mr. Bashford, at this juncture, I would recommend that we take a short break.
I think that's good.
We are a bit ahead of schedule.
Yep. We're on recess.
More from the Defense Advisory Committee meeting on sexual assaults in the military, with remarks by representatives from the various branches on their policies for those who report sexual misconduct. The Defense Advisory Committee is tasked with bringing its recommendations to the Secretary of Defense and the Armed Services Committees of Congress. This is an hour and a half.
Before we continue with our next panel, I would like Ms. Garvin to have the mic for a moment.
Yes, thank you. During the break, I had the opportunity to speak just a little bit further with Ms. Stolberg, who spoke to us before, and I asked her about her service dog that she had with her. And I apologize for not thinking to ask her while she was there, but she authorized me to share, A, how much the service dog has aided in her recovery and how important the dog is, and B, she authorized me to share that she paid for the dog out of pocket and did not have access to that as part of her recovery in any formal way. And so I just thought it was important for us to know that piece of information in light of how much it has helped in her recovery.
Thank you. Okay, we're now going to begin with the briefing on the Department of Defense and Military Services Expedited Transfer policies. We have quite the distinguished panel. The only person is Ms. Massey, who is missing from our printed agenda. Have you determined how you're going to start?
I think I'll just start briefly here, and then we'll probably go on down the row. Is that okay with folks? Yeah.
Okay, Dr. Galbraith, you have the mic.
Great. Greetings. It's very nice to be here and see you all again. Thank you so much for talking about expedited transfers. We are, to give you a little bit of context for how expedited transfers came up, in about 2011, the Sexual Assault Prevention Response Program was about 4 or 5 years old, and actually about 6 years old. And we had lots of conversations. We had fielded a cadre of sexual assault response coordinators and victim advocates out to the field. We had created a response system, but what we were finding is that there were still some significant gaps in what we could do to support victims as they went through the military justice process as well as the recovery process. So one of the things that kind of sparked additional focus on this problem was Secretary Panetta, and he went and had a conversation with a number of members of Congress in the fall of 2011, and he asked what else could we do to push the program forward, what could we do to make a real difference. One of the first things that we were able to do was to create expedited transfers. We had heard that folks were coming forward, they were making reports of sexual assault, but as you heard previously, some of them were not able to move from a unit or get away from the individual that had sexually assaulted them. And from a clinical psychology standpoint, I would tell you that the continued re-traumatization of having to be exposed to that person or the people that impacted you in that horrific way prevents you from healing. It retards your healing process when you are continually re-traumatized, and that's one of the things that we thought that with this expedited transfer process we might be able to jumpstart, at least give people a chance. And as we were having conversations with not only
victims, but also members on the Hill. They thought this was also a very important piece as well. So we all largely came to the conclusion that this would be a helpful approach. So with me today is my senior policy advisor, Diana Rangusis, and she's going to give you a little bit more of the details to the expedited transfer process. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking a look at this. We think that this is one of the things that has really been helpful for healing, and has evolved a little bit over time since we kicked it off in 2012.
Thank you very much for inviting us to speak to you today. I have been with the Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office.
You got to keep your voice, either get the mic a little closer or keep your voice up a bit. Thank you.
I will try. I don't project as well as Dr. Galbraith. I have been with the office since 2009, so I was responsible for crafting the first expedited transfer guidance. And so I will detail a little bit of the history, just provide some dates to what Dr. Galbraith already covered, and then get into a bit of the detail of the policy. The first expedited transfer guidance was issued on May 6th by the then Undersecretary Dr. Stanley. The services were required to issue him guidance with following 3 criteria: that there was a presumption in favor of transferring the sexual assault victims if there was a credible report, ensuring that the transfer would not negatively impact the victim's career, and finally authorizing an appeal to the first general or flag officer in the chain if the first expedited transfer request was denied. Each military service submitted their expedited transfer policies by May 31st of 2011. But as Dr. Galbraith mentioned, there was a lot of congressional interest. There were still a lot of discussions between Sapper, our department, and the Hill. So consequently, in addition to severance policies, Sapper crafted a DoD-wide directive-type memorandum, which is a temporary policy that's across DoD. And this was issued on December 16th, and later incorporated into permanent DoD instruction that was when it was updated on March 28, 2013. Congress passed its own version of the expedited transfer mandate on December 31st in the NDA for FY 2012. And in that mandate, it included 72-hour time frame for making that decision to approve or disapprove the expedited transfer, and also the 72-hour for the appeal process. As Dr. Galbraith mentioned, in January 18th, a month after, the detail was issued and the NDA, in a DoD news briefing at the Pentagon, Secretary Panetta announced the expedited transfer policy. And he stated that it would provide greater support for the victims of sexual assault, giving victims protection from possible harassment and removing them from the proximity to the alleged perpetrator. In the NDA for FY 2014, Congress spoke again. This time they added the expedited transfer law by authorizing the transfer of the suspect. This was covered already in our DTM, so we did not have to alter our policy. So let me turn now to a little bit of the detail of the actual policy. So the intent behind the expedited transfer policy is not for safety. It's for a situation where a victim feels safe but feels uncomfortable. So where the victim is in close proximity to the alleged perpetrator, is perceiving ostracism or retaliation, or wants to leave the location where the event occurred to stop triggering these horrible memories. Victims are informed of the availability of the expedited transfer at the time that they file their unrestricted report with their sexual assault response coordinator or the victim advocate. It is the victim's choice and has to be initiated by a service member. Once it's submitted to the commander then has to annotate the time and the date, because he has 72 hours or she has 72 hours to respond. The policy does establish a presumption in favor of transferring the service member following a credible report. And that credible report determination is made by the commander with their advice from the SJA and the MCIO, the military criminal investigator, when reviewing all the evidence that is available at the time. If there is no credible report found, then the reasons for that decision must also be documented. There is a misconception as to the presumption, though. The presumption is in favor of the transfer. It's not in favor of the exact location of the transfer. So the transfer could be permanent. It could be a temporary detail for 90 days somewhere else to assess if the victim can recover. It could be outside of the installation. It could be within the installation, to different barracks, to a different duty location. There were a lot to a night shift instead of a day shift. And again, also the suspect could be transferred instead of the victim. So the commander has a lot of flexibility based on the victim's wishes, but also the necessity of the operational needs. If approved, the transfer order shall include the service member's dependent, if accompanied, the military spouse, if the military spouse consents. In most circumstances, the transfers to a different installation should be completed within 30 days. If within the installation, they should be completed within a week. And again, we say should because there are a lot of different details and circumstances that go along, especially if they're dependents or military spouses. Again, we mentioned already that if the commander must act within 72 hours. If the commander disapproves that expedited transfer, it is the victim's choice. It's not automatic. It's the victim's choice whether to appeal. And the victim wants to appeal that, then the first flag or general officer in the victim's chain has 72 hours whether to approve or disapprove. Military departments are required to make every reasonable effort to minimize disruption to normal career progression of a service member who requests an expedited transfer. When authorized an expedited transfer, a commander has an enumerated list to review, and I believe all of you have a handout. Handout 1 has that enumerated list. I want to just point out 3 of the criteria that has to be reviewed. One of them is whether a temporary transfer would meet the service member's needs and the operational needs of the unit, the availability of positions within other units on the installation, and the status of the investigation and potential impact on the investigation and future dispositions of the offense after consultation with the investigating MCIOs. Service members requesting a transfer also shall be advised that if the case is determined that it should go to court-martial, that they may have to return for that court-martial proceeding. Also in that handout number 1, there are 4 additional areas of which the service members has to be fully informed. One of them that I wanted to highlight to you is the potential impact of the transfer or reassignment on the investigation and case disposition or the initiation of other adverse action against the offender. Now, when a victim is transferred out, there is a warm handoff to the receiving commander if the victim is still receiving advocacy services and if the investigation or the legal proceedings are still ongoing. Now, the reason why this is done is to facilitate the investigation and to facilitate additional services for the victim. So the losing commander will limit the information to objective facts about the victim care provided, the status of the open investigation, and the status of ongoing legal proceedings. Handout number 2 that you have speaks to the commander's responsibility in the monthly case management group. So for every adult sexual assault case that is an unrestricted report, there is a monthly case management group meeting. During that meeting, they review all victim services, and also they discuss direct system coordination. All relevant parties come together, including advocates, healthcare, investigators, law enforcement, legal officers, and they have a discussion about the case. They discuss any challenges being experienced. They discuss any allegations of retaliation, not only against the victim, but against the victim advocate or any responders or any other members to the case. They also discuss expedited transfers, military protective orders, and any safety issues. Now, the MCOs conducting the case at the original location have to call in to that monthly CMG meeting at their new location, as do the legal officers. And they provide updates on the progress or challenges with the investigation to the installation commander in an effort to facilitate any investigation issues. The case will stay on the CMG agenda until all investigations and legal proceedings are complete and the victim has declined any further advocacy services. In conclusion, the Expedited Transfer Program is a service that favorably contributes to victims' lives and recovery. You know, it's very difficult for victims to come forward, as our last survivor who spoke to us told us. This is always extremely challenging. It's amazing that people ever come forward and tell us such a horrific event that happened in their lives. The expedited transfer has been mandated by Congress on 2 separate occasions, so it has a lot of congressional interest and support. And to echo Secretary Panetta, the service provides great support for victims of sexual assault by protecting them from possible harassment and by removing them from proximity to the alleged perpetrator. Thank you, and I look forward to addressing any questions that you may have.
I think we'll hold questions. Can we hold questions to the end of everybody speaks? Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Paul Rosen. I'm with Navy. I'm the Director of Navy Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Branch. I've been in that role since 2013 as a civilian and prior to that in uniform. I'm not going to be duplicative of what Nate and Diana have said, so I'll just talk a little specifically about the importance to Navy of the expedited transfer policy and process. In addition to it being the right thing to do, which is to support victims in any way that we can, it's important for Navy, for any sailor that suffered a trauma, particularly one of this nature, to do everything we can to try to get them both personally and professionally well, and so that they can continue their career and continue to contribute to the service which hopefully they love, and that we need them to do. We have found that the reasons that sailors request expedited transfers are, as Diana indicated, moving away from the subject of the report. We also find a lot of people who request an expedited transfer to move closer to support infrastructure, whether that be family or friends, and in some cases for specific support services, depending where they were located prior. Maybe they were worldwide somewhere and they need to move somewhere for additional support services. The policy has been in place for several years. As you have heard, we've just completed in Navy a review of our process to try to make sure that it's as good as it can be, and there's probably some minor peaks and tweaks that we're going to make to that. One specific policy piece in Navy that is a little bit different is that in the request process, if the request by the victim to make an expedited transfer is not approved by the commanding officer within Navy, it automatically goes to the first flag officer. It doesn't require the victim to make another request. And then there's a 72-hour time period for which that first flag officer then ultimately makes the decision to turn it down or approve it. So again, without being duplicative of what Nate and Diana have said, I want to thank you again for inviting us to discuss this, and look forward to any questions you may have.
Ms. Reed.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Gail Reed. I work at Headquarters Marine Corps Sexual Assault Prevention and Response. I'm one of their program and policy specialists. I've been with the program since 2011, and I was on board when the policies were stood up and the Marine Corps took on the task of implementing the expedited transfer process, and have been supporting it since that time. And when the Marine Corps looked at implementing the policy, which I'm not going to reiterate, it was important to us to keep the victims' needs in mind, as well as to make sure that it was a seamless process for our Marine Corps transfers. We wanted the Marine who was getting an expedited transfer to flow back into the normal process and not stand out any more than necessary. So we took it upon ourselves to work with our manpower management SMEs, and together we built a process where Headquarters Marine Corps serves as the liaison. The Sarcs, the victim advocates, and the commanders work with the victims who submit their requests through, and it's all worked out at their location. It comes to the headquarters staff. We walk downstairs and we work with we hand the paperwork to our manpower, and that just flows right into our regular transfer process. There are only certain people in the manpower management that work those expedited transfers. So again, we're doing our utmost to ensure that the victim is not pointed out or registered within their world, so that when the transfer happens, it just looks on their record as a transfer. That was important to us. We've been very successful. We just went through another review of our own processes and released a new letter of instruction. We have included expedited transfer process in our pre-command training with our commanders, so that they are getting from headquarters what that is to look like and their roles and responsibilities, whether they are receiving a victim or whether they are losing a victim, because there's things that they need to know on both sides of that equation. So again, I believe it's been a very successful process. Our Sarcs are very supportive at the fleet level, and we have support at the headquarters level. So again, I'll be more than happy to answer any questions, and thank you for this opportunity.
Colonel Prince.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yes, I'm Colonel Melanie Prince, and I am the Chief of the Interpersonal Self-Directed Violence Division at Headquarters Air Force, so that's ISDV. And within ISDV, we are it is responsible for the strategic guidance for 5 types of violence, one being sexual violence. and it is in the sexual violence branch that we have the Air Force Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office. So I've been with the program for all of 3 months officially, although I have been engaged with the Air Force Sapper office for about a year. So again, I'll try not to be repetitive, as my colleagues have already mentioned, but our Expedited Transfer program has policy, process, and procedures that are codified primarily at the Air Force Personnel Center Assignment Office, the Air Force Sexual Assault Prevention and Response, and the Air Force Family Advocacy Program. So 3 areas where we have regulations. And the expedited transfer process is designed to meet the needs of the victim following an unrestricted report of a sexual assault while balancing mission requirements as assessed by the chain of command. Additionally, as part of a comprehensive and system-based response capability for sexual assault victims and survivors, other agencies play a critical role in the execution of the Expedited Transfer program as it relates to victim advocacy, to include but not limited to the Special Victims Council, physical and mental health care from our medical agencies, rigorous investigations from the Office of Special Investigations, accountability via the military justice process facilitated by the Judge Advocate General's Corps, a legal agency, and then mission effectiveness and mission continuity from our command leadership structure, which is also aided by counsel from a majority of the response agencies that I've just listed. So very much a systems-based approach. So the result is an expedited transfer program that has vertical and horizontal checks and balances to drive the policy intent for our airmen and their families. So the Air Force Sapper Office assesses the expedited transfer program using feedback, survivor stories, and record reviews to look for opportunities to improve the process. So for example, the Air Force has focused on ensuring that we have the ability to transition victims to locations where the victim feels safe and supported and continue the healing process. So when possible, transfers are approved to assist in a victim's recovery by moving to a new location where no one knows of that sexual assault. But a recent improvement to the process ensures that both the commander, as you've already heard, and the Sark, the gaining Sark, are aware of the arrival of that airman. And again, based on feedback and reviews that we've done, we ensure confidentiality is maintained, but it allows the unit commander and the Sark to have awareness and the ability to react appropriately in the event a victim requires additional services or support after arrival. So this policy change was published this very month through an Air Force guidance memorandum that went out to the field last week. So in closing, the Air Force is committed to the smooth and orderly execution of expedited transfer policy for both victims and alleged offenders. We support victim recovery by offering expedited transfers of victims and our transfers of alleged offenders as one of several options to facilitate an environment conducive for care and recovery. We facilitate the program by ensuring training is relevant, realistic, and rooted in official guidance. And we are continuously reviewing the program at the headquarters level and also work very diligently to sustain a culture of continuous improvement. We want our program to be collaborative with all of the agencies, and we're constantly making these assessments at all levels of the enterprise. So we value feedback of all types, and we methodically use it to build the most effective programs possible to support our airmen and their families, especially when we realize that they're most vulnerable. So thank you for the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Carl. Lieutenant Stiles.
Good afternoon. My name is Lieutenant Amanda Stiles. I'm with the United States Coast Guard. I am a Central Assignments Coordinator at the Personnel Service Center. I oversee several rates for enlisted personnel. We focus on transfers of members, whether it be normal PCS transfers as well as expedited transfer requests. Unlike the other DoD services, the Coast Guard is unique in that the Personnel Service Center handles all transfer requests, and that includes expedited transfers. Local area commanders don't have that authority. So all of those requests will come to the Coast Guard, to PSC, and they'll be evaluated at that time for the appropriate offices. So for officers, it'll go to OPM. For enlisted personnel, it'll go to EPM. I'll kind of go through our procedures with that. Upon a request of a expedited transfer, the Sapper SIT, or the Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Crisis Intervention Team, which is a lot like the case management group that was referred to earlier, will convene. That includes the Sarc, the special agent in charge, the judge advocate or service legaling office, as well as a medical representative and a senior representative from the victims and subjects commands. They'll meet to determine how to process the request. They'll determine what area the victim has, if the victim is making the request to transfer themselves or to have the alleged subject moved. That also can occur at the victim's request. The victim will make the request to move, let's say they want to move to an area with a confirmed support network, mother, father, brother, sister, as well as continuing to get those recovery services that they are that they can get. The request will come to PSC within 72 hours, and the PSC will have 2 weeks to determine if we can approve their request. At that time, we will cut the orders. They'll have 7 days. They have 7 days to execute those, and they will be moved. PSC does not make the notification to the receiving command. That responsibility falls to the Sapper SIT to brief the incoming command of the situation. If there is a denial of that request, again, like the DOD, it will go to the next flag officer, and then it will be forwarded on to PSC, to our flag, for adjudication of that case at that time. We find that we want to provide the most career progression for the member, as well as balancing the needs of the service. We find that we have had very good success in getting the member services, and often we engage with we will re-engage with the Sarc to confirm that the member is receiving the services that they need and for the best possible outcome of this. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Ms. Massey.
All right. Hi, I am Laura Massey. I am the Policy Branch Chief for the Department of Army Sexual Harassment Assault Response and Prevention Office. I've been in this position since 2015. Overall, the Army's policy mirrors the DoD policies that were already briefed by Sapper, but I wanted to take an opportunity to share with you our processes and procedures that are specific to the Army. Our service-specific expedited transfer policy is contained in an Army directive titled Expedited Transfers or Reassignment Procedures for Victims of Sexual Assault, dated October 3rd, 2011. There are annual military personnel messages, or MILPERS, that supplement this policy, and the Army's Human Resources Command published the most current MILPER in February of 2017. It is also the Army's policy that there is a presumption in favor of transfer or reassignment of a sexual assault victim at his or her request following a credible report of sexual assault. A report of sexual assault is credible when the commander, battalion or above, after considering all available evidence and advice of the supporting legal officer, concludes that there are reasonable grounds to believe an offense constituting sexual assault has been committed against the person requesting the transfer or reassignment. A transfer or reassignment includes, but is not limited to, the victim's temporary or permanent movement to a unit within the same battalion or brigade, to a unit within the same division, to a unit on the same installation, or to a unit at a different geographic location. For our reserve component members, a transfer or reassignment might include provisions to perform their enacted duty on a different weekend or at different times from the subject or with a different unit than in the home drilling location. When a victim files an unrestricted report, the Sexual Assault Response Coordinator, or SARC, or the Victim Advocate, VA, will notify them of their ability to request an expedited transfer. When a victim files their restricted report, they are notified at that time, and expedited transfer would not be an option. All SARCs and VAs receive training regarding the expedited transfer process during their professional training. A soldier must initiate the transfer request in writing on an Army Personnel Action Form, a DA 4187, and submit the request to their commanding officer. The commanding officer will document the date and time the request is received, and within 72 hours from the receipt of the soldier's request for reassignment or transfer, the commander in the chain of command, an 05 minimum, must provide a decision regarding the soldier's request. The approval authority for local moves that do not cross Army commands, Army service component commands, and direct reporting units, otherwise known as ACOM, ASSE, and DRUs, is the lowest level commander exercising authority over both the losing and gaining unit. The disapproval authority is the first general officer or senior executive service, GO-SES, in the soldier's chain of command. Decision by the GO-SES must be made within 72 hours of the commander's recommendation of disapproval. The approval authority for local moves that do cross the ACOM, ASSE, DRUs is the senior commander at the installation. The disapproval authority for local moves that cross those ACOM, ASSE, DRUs is the senior commander at the installation, provided that the senior commander is a general officer. If the senior commander is not a GO, then disapproval authority is the first GO or SES in the soldier's chain of command. Decision by the GO must be made within 72 hours again. The commanding general of the Human Resources Command has assignment authorities to execute PCS moves for the victims of sexual assault. Command endorsements for an expedited transfer involving a PCS move are sent to HRC and contain a CID case number or civilian equivalent and a statement from the soldier explaining why they are requesting the move. The command endorsement should include appropriate recommendations to the first commander in the chain of command exercising the general court's martial convening authority. The commander will include in the recommendation that they consulted with the legal advisor and believe there is a credible report of sexual assault, that a local move was considered, the victim was informed of any potential impact of the move on the investigation, the victim may have to return for prosecution, future disposition of the allegation and potential prosecution or other adverse action that may be initiated against the alleged offender, the potential for any bonus recruitment if applicable, reasonably foreseeable career impacts, and any other possible outcomes that could come from granting such request. They also state that the soldier understands the selection of a permanent change of station does not guarantee the station of choice, and that they believe the reassignment is in the best interest of the soldier and the organization. Recommendations for PCS disapproval of a credible report require command endorsement with justification forwarded to HRC with the original request. The commanding general of HRC, normally a major general, is the disapproving authority. A victim may request PCS locations as a part of their expedited transfer request. PCS expedited transfers are ordinarily made to a valid authorized requirement in the continental United States and in accordance with the needs of the Army. However, due to the size of the Army does have latitude to grant soldier location requests. HRC does its best to honor the PCS location when possible. If the soldier is in a high-density MOS, such as infantry, field artillery, military police, HRC is more likely to honor the request as the Army does have more the flexibility. It becomes difficult to honor requests with low-density MOSs, such as a parachute rigger or technical specialist, as there must be an authorized requirement at the location. Since the policy went into effect 6 years ago, more victims have been transferred to Fort Hood than any other location in the Department of the Army. In closing, the Army feels the Expedited Transfer Program is a service offered to victims to help them recover. Victims of sexual assault may not wish to remain in their current unit or organizations after the sexual assault incident. Requiring a soldier to remain when they have a desire to leave the unit or organization may negatively affect their safety and emotional well-being, as well as the functioning of the unit or the organization. Expediting the review of and action on a victim's request for transfer or reassignment is an important component of a leader's response to a credible report of a sexual assault. Thank you. I look forward to answering your questions.
Plenty of time for questions.
I'll start off.
Chief McKinley.
Thank you all for being here. I have a question, and I'd like for each branch to answer this question so that we can get the perspective from all the services. Could you tell us the effect of the transfer on the victim participation in the military justice system, the victim care and services, and do you have any data on the retention of those transfer victims in each branch of service?
Okay, on behalf of Navy then, the effect on the victim within the military justice system, I believe, sir, is one of the things you've asked. And I don't have specific statistics that would indicate participation by an expedited transfer victim as a percentage of the whole versus a victim's participation without. So that would be something that, if is interested, we would have to go back and see if we could grab. Anecdotally, there doesn't appear to be, there's nothing that we're aware of at this point that would indicate a gap in the process, any more so than we would find in a non-expedited transfer victim.
So, if I may, so that we can maybe give you a preview of what the data will say when we come back and talk to you in January. Our data right now says that folks that receive an expedited transfer participate in the justice system at just about the same rate as folks that don't receive an expedited transfer. But the exact numbers and data and what each service picture will look like will be coming to you when we come back and see you in January.
Thank you, sir.
And sir, I think you also asked about the support system for expedited transfer victims?
Yeah, victim care and services.
Right. And again, we have no indication that the expedited transfer victims' support services and care is any different than any other unrestricted reporting victim. So there's nothing that we've seen that would indicate that. That, I'm sure.
And then also retention. Do we have any idea what the retention is of those
we just began looking at that in Navy because we did a look at our process, and because of the fact that the policy is relatively new, there's not a tremendous amount of runtime to determine whether we see higher or lower retention than we would for either unrestricted reporting victims who don't request expedited transfer versus sailors who don't make a report of a sexual assault at all. That is something that we're continuing to pursue with a follow-on study since we have a little bit more runtime now behind us. But at this point, I don't have any data to provide to you.
That would be the same with the Marine Corps with regard to the retention data. The impact on services with regard to victim care and support. One of the things that we look at very closely within the Sarcs before the request will come to us, and then once it does come through us, we are very cognizant of what services are needed, and we make sure that the locations, Manpower management is also very cognizant of what is where. And so our goal is to make sure that they are transferred to a location that has the needed support services that are available to them. We specifically would not, even if a victim would request like an I&I or a reserve unit that is sitting in a remote location, even though it might be near a support system, we would have a conversation with the Sarc to go through how damaging that could be to be in an isolated location, working in a very small unit, and we would try to redirect their preference to a location where they would get better support and have the facilities around them. So it's a team effort on our part to ensure that if a victim is still in the process and wanting advocacy, that they get placed in a location where they can get that care and support.
Yes, sir. Thank you for that. So similar to my colleagues here, I don't have any data either on the retention aspect of your question. In terms of victim care and services, that is one of the considerations that we expect the commanders to discuss with the victim when they are requesting that expedited transfer. And I also believe, I mentioned in my remarks that a new guidance memo was published this last week, which allows the Air Force to notify that gaining commander and Sarc. So the hope there is that there will be even more discussion and analysis of what is available in the local area to support that victim even prior to transferring to the new location. And in terms of the data on victim in the military justice system, I know that data is pending. We're collecting that to give to you all a little bit later. But I would just have to say that these are active duty members, and I know that the justice system can certainly connect and reach out and touch them at all times from the victim's perspective. We have not found where anything changes in their ability to participate or not participate in the system. Thank you.
Like my colleagues, I don't have any data about their retention or the military justice system, their participation. I will say when we look at Confirmed Support Network, in their memo that is submitted to PSC, it has a section for medical support services that are requested at that time, as well as what is that Confirmed Support Network. So we want to ensure that the victims are getting the best possible services where they're going, as well as also providing that emotional support system to where they may be PCSing to.
And also, like my colleagues, I don't have data on the retention nor the specifics on the participation in the military justice system, though that is one of the things the commander does discuss with the victim, the possibility they will have to travel back to participate. As far as the support system, as I alluded to, especially our high density MOSs, first they look at making sure there are services at the location, the government provided services, much that was alluded to, like my colleague from the Marine Corps. But then because there a lot of times are multiple locations, they can then look at the request of the soldier and see if they have that family or friend support network nearby. So they are able to provide that sort of not only the victim care, but the support system on the outside as well.
I'm glad you asked that question about retention. It is a research study to do, and we are doing that research. I don't think I'll have anything for you in January, but we are looking at a number of different sources to get after that, and we've funded some research to understand exactly how that works. As you know, there's no identifier really in a personnel system that would say that you're a victim of sexual assault or not. So that means that lines up with the folks that we have on file in the Defense Sexual Assault Incident Database. And then I have to marry that up with people who have then separated. But then in addition to that, we also have to know whether or not that's, to give you a context, we have to know what the normal separation rate is for folks anyway, so that you can see whether or not separation is higher or lower for folks that have experienced a sexual assault and or participated in the transfer program. So it's not a press the button and watch it print.
I actually believe retention is a very important thing, because all branches, we care about retention.
Agreed.
But if someone is sexually assaulted, and they choose to leave and not have a career in our military because of the sexual assault, they're also going to be a recruiter out there, but it's not going to be a positive recruiter for our military. Mm-hmm. So how we take care of victims, and if we can retain them and do positive things for them, that's great. But so we actually need the numbers.
Agreed.
Judge Grimm.
Sir, I just wanted to just add to that. The role of the monthly case management group meeting is to check up on the victim services. So that's why when the victim is transferred, there is that notification to that gaining commander. And in that discussion on the monthly meeting, they talk about whatever accesses to services the victim wants. So whether it's medical, mental health, if they're having difficulty getting into the mental health clinic, that's something that the installation commander can facilitate, maybe facilitate through an MOU to a nearby facility or things like that. But that monthly check-in helps to quickly identify what parts of the system are not working for that victim, even when they transfer in.
I'd like to hear from each of the service representatives whether or not there is any method in place that you have adopted to assess from the perspective of the service person requesting transfer how well they think the system is working. When they get to the new command, do they feel as though they are arriving without any stigma associated with the circumstances under which they were transferred? Do they view the services that they are receiving as services that are equal to or better than the services that might have been available from the location where they were transferred from? We have foreseen the very similar top-down directives that have come from higher headquarters as to what's to be done. How do you measure your success from the views of the people that you are trying to take care of?
So one of the things that we will make sure that the committee gets is the results of our force-wide survey that asks the very questions that you just did, that of the folks that received the force-wide survey and experienced a sexual assault and received an expedited transfer, we have rates of at least how well that worked for them on a number of different variables. And rather than go into great detail right now, we'll make sure that you get the results of those of a force-wide survey called the Workplace and Gender Relations Survey, as well as the Military Investigation and Justice Experience Survey, which is a survey that goes directly to just to victims of sexual assault that have completed their participation in the justice system. And so we'll make sure the committee gets that data. But
Those anonymous responses?
they are, the Justice Experience Survey is an anonymous survey. The Workplace and Gender Relations Survey is a confidential survey.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I just have a follow-up question. What is the response rate on those surveys? Do you have a high response rate?
Yeah, so with the Workplace and Gender Relations Survey, our response rate is usually between 29 and 30%, but it's a randomized stratified sample, so they're very good and reliable and representative of the entire force and generalizable to the entire force. The Military Justice Experience Survey is a little bit different. I have been looking at ways to boost the response rate, actually very low response rate to that one, and it only represents about 150 so victims this last year, and the first time we did it was 2 years ago, and only about 200 folks responded back to us. So at the end of the day,
How does that translate into a response rate?
well, I don't have it that percentage off the top of my head, but I can tell you it's fairly low. It's not as high as we would like it to be, and it certainly is not generalizable. It's a convenient sample of folks that completed the justice process. Again, more information coming to you.
Just to make sure I understand, you have described the feedback process. Is that for all services, which you've identified as identical for all services?
Yes, the Workplace and Gender Relations Survey is force-wide, so it generates representative numbers for the DoD as a whole. Keep in mind that the smaller categories you go into, margins of error increase because it is a representative sample. Bottom line is that some categories we're not able to necessarily report out by every service, but we can give you the DoD experience as a whole.
Judge Walton.
Several of you indicated that the expedited transfer can be both for the victim and the alleged perpetrator. Is that true for all of the services?
To clarify, sir, the policy applies to victims that make an unrestricted report of a sexual assault. For the good order and discipline of any unit, the commanding officer can always move an individual away from the unit, and that would be the policy, at least within Navy, that potentially would be used for a subject. It's not a request by the subject, though.
You know what the percentage is when these type of allegations are made as to whether there's a transfer of the alleged victim or the alleged perpetrator?
No, sir, I do not for Navy. I can't speak on behalf of the other services.
And when an alleged perpetrator is transferred, is someone notified at that new location of why the transfer has occurred?
Again, speaking on behalf of Navy, we don't have a policy per se that would enable a subject of a sexual assault to be transferred. Typically what would happen if they are moved out of their unit, it's probably within that same chain of command, maybe from like a squadron to a wing level, particularly if there's an investigation and potential adjudication ongoing. That's not necessarily something that somebody that the Navy would transfer anyway.
But several branches, I thought, did say you could transfer the suspect, so I'd like to know the answer to Judge Walton's question about would the receiving facility in a suspect transfer know the reason why?
And just to clarify, it's required by law. So back in NDA for 2012, that was the expedited transfer for the victim. And again, victim initiated with that 72-hour time frame. For the suspect, it came out for the NDA in FY14. And there is no time frame required. It could happen any time. It's not for punitive reasons. They explicitly stated that it's for good order and discipline.
I'm sorry, it's for?
Good order and discipline. So both types of transfers are required by law.
Does anybody have any statistics on how often that's done?
Yes, we do. And we can
they're
provide
not in
those.
our material.
It's in the Sapper annual report. Several hundred cases of expedited transfers happen every year. The numbers that are declined are very small. I don't have the top numbers right off the top of my head, but I can tell you that one of the reasons that we track is that the subject or the accused was moved instead, and I have numbers on that.
But again, I just want to follow up on Judge Walton's question. Whether it's being said it's for the good of the order, it's still a suspect being transferred, presumably where the complainant doesn't want to be or elects not to. So is the receiving institution told the underlying reason for the good of the order that this person is being transferred?
For the Marine Corps, there's a requirement for the commanders to be reviewing all inbound personnel, and if there is a sexual assault related incident, it would be on that record. So it's a protocol that is followed for any inbound transfer, and they should be annotating. It would be annotated, but I would concur with the Navy that the commanders have that good order and discipline, and they are probably maintaining control of the alleged offender or the alleged subject. But in any event, the commanders it would be on that Marine's record, and the commander would have eyes on that.
Policy any different for any of the other branches?
So for the Air Force, I would have to confirm with my colleagues just because I'm a little bit new at this. So to answer that specific question as to whether the gaining command is notified of the circumstances surrounding the alleged offender. However, similar to my colleague here, any inbound airmen, certainly the commanders are looking into that person's record, but I can certainly get back to the committee on that. And there was another question. So yes, the Air Force, as she said, this is law. Both victim and alleged offender do have the opportunity for that expedited transfer. I can say, though, that the receiving sexual assault response coordinator, the Sarc, will not be a participant on the alleged offender aspect of the transfer because they are advocates for the victim.
Right, if I might clarify, thank you for bringing that up. Yes, we do not, our program at the Headquarters Marine Corps, we are not involved in any movement of the alleged offender. We do not classify that as an expedited transfer. It's all managed under the commander's options for good order and discipline, and it's just a Marine Corps move if that is the direction the commander opts to take.
Do you want to finish up with the last two branches?
For the Coast Guard, that is something that is handled. We do have the alleged subject moved. We have policies in place for that. The receiving command will be notified through the Sapper sit. Usually it's done through the legal channels, and we usually try to place the alleged subject within the same jurisdiction area. So let's say the incident occurs in Miami, we're going to try to keep that person somewhere within Florida in order to allow the case to continue. But the alleged subject has to be offered the opportunity to continue to progress within their career, to be serving in a public area, and with oversight. But the number of people that know, which is limited to the senior command officials.
And for the Army, it is very similar as well. The commander can decide to move a subject, often does not for the purposes of the judicial process. However, all subjects their personnel files are flagged. So if a subject is moved, that flag would be in their file for the new command team to see that they are a subject.
On that, I just want to make sure I understand what it is that the new command has as information about the reason for the suspect being transferred. I appreciate it's delicate, that the investigation may be new, by definition there was a credible determination of a complaint, otherwise it would not be something that would be thought necessary for the order of good order and discipline in the military. But that's a generic category. And if the receiving command only hears that there's a flag on the file and that they've been transferred for the good order and discipline, and they don't have some idea, even though there has been no adjudication and you have to protect both the rights of the victim as well as the rights of the accused, do they have information at least that alerts them that there may have been this allegation, if for no other reason than to make sure that they're not sending them to another location where there could be another victim? That's, I think, the level of detail that we're trying to get our hands on. Just to have a stamp that says they're being sent out for the good order and discipline of the military, and that there's a flag on that allows any number of inferences that can be drawn.
Agreed.
So I cannot answer for their services as to what policies they have, but let me provide the committee a little bit of context. As my former life, I was an Air Force Office of Special Investigations criminal investigator, and while this policy didn't exist when I was a criminal investigator, what I will tell you is that when a criminal investigation happens, one of the first steps is that the individual is put on some kind of administrative hold, flagged, or things along those lines. This is so that the individual can't initiate a PCS move, can't initiate any kind of go to school or train and things like that, and move away, retire, or separate. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that command is regularly briefed about the status of a criminal investigation, and so a move like this, at the end of the drill, I would tell you is that the staff judge advocates, the defense attorneys, the criminal investigators, all are going to have dibs on where the accused is going to be. In other words, the person isn't just picked up and moved off into a system somewhere, that this person is part or the target or the subject of an active criminal investigation. So it's not as though someone's going to turn up in your unit and you would not know that this person is under investigation, because this person is going to be going through a justice proceeding or things along those lines. So allow us to connect the dots for you on what the policies say in each of the services, but that's the context.
Very helpful, but under investigation for a sexual assault or just under investigation for any of the 134 articles in the Uniform Code of Military Justice?
That's correct. We'll have to find that out for you.
I have a follow-up to that. Are there any due process rights for the accused or the suspect when they're moved? For example, I understand that's for good order and discipline, but for them being a subject of a sex assault investigation, there's no other reason for them to be moved for good order and discipline. So my question is, is there an appeals process for them? And then also, the follow-up to that is, how are the military defense bars responding to suspect moves? Are they filing motions for relief for unlawful pretrial treatment? Are they seeking Mason credit? Do we know if there's any impact on the military justice system?
So I'll give you a very respectful, I don't know, I'm not an attorney. But what I would offer to you is those are really good questions for the follow-up attorneys for some of those. In the law, I can tell you that there is no provision that I know of that allows a commander to move the suspects they're accused of a sexual assault of any kind of relief or anything, because it's not as a result of a legal determination. Again, the Congress was very explicit that it was for the good order and discipline within the unit. So I would say you'll have to follow up with the staff judge advocates, the SVCs, and the defense counsel.
I have a question on the, it seems to me that people covered under FAP, or FAP, I don't know how you say it.
Family Advocacy Program.
Are, there's a carve out for the expedited transfer. So if somebody who would be covered under FAP is the victim of a sexual assault, what avenues are available to them?
And Kathy Robertson will be here in January to answer your questions on the Family Advocacy Program.
But so anybody who falls under that is not covered in the stats we get under expedited transfers?
From the Sapper program, that is correct.
And from the services, you all have a carve out for that? All of you?
Yes.
So any stats from the Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, Army, Force, expedited transfers would not cover family members then, right?
Correct.
Okay.
But the statute doesn't make a distinction, does it? Does the statute make a distinction?
Diana?
The statute does
It just
not.
talks about sexual assault,
The
right?
statute just refers to the articles.
So theoretically, there should be something similar at the other side.
Yes, Kathy Robertson has some data for you.
Chair Bashford, I just wanted to draw the committee's attention. The data that Dr. Galbraith was kind enough to reference, everybody transfer data from the FY16 report, is actually in your read at the review it, that's fine.
Yeah.
And I had a question about I noticed in looking at that data for 2016, there were 19 cases, I believe that was the right number, where the request by the victim for an expedited transfer was denied. Why are those requests denied typically?
We have all the reasons why. Sometimes the person is undergoing a medical evaluation board, and that locks them out of being able to be moved. Sometimes the accused is moved instead. Sometimes there's not a credible report. And then there's a couple other categories that I don't remember right off the top of my head.
For the cases where it's determined that the report was not credible, do you have any data or anecdotal information on the impact of the victim's credibility at trial?
I do not.
So, for example, a defense attorney saying, you put in, under cross-examination, you requested an expedited transfer, true? Yes, I did. And it was denied, wasn't it? Yes, it was. And it was denied because your commander and the military police found that there was not credible information. True.
It's a possibility, but because the numbers are so small, my guess, and in addition to that, if there was no credible evidence at that time, that might be end up in an unfounded case that wouldn't necessarily go forward in the justice process. That's my guess with knowing how the data works, but again, I can't answer directly for that.
So an expedited transfer determination could potentially have an impact on even whether a case can be shepherded through the military justice system.
It's possible. It certainly is possible.
I think they would have to look at, respectfully, I mean, expedited transfer requests come in at very different times.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we have expedited...
I'm sorry, we're really having trouble.
Okay, expedited transfer requests come in at different times. They even come in after the end of court-martial when the suspect is found not guilty, right? So depending on when the expedited transfer request comes in is when they're looking at the evidence before them. Just because there's not enough evidence or to find a credible report at that moment does not mean that there's not more evidence coming in later on.
And I understand that. My primary concern is the impact on the victim should that victim find him or herself on the witness stand at a trial, and earlier in the process they've been denied an expedited transfer because there wasn't credible information. That's all I was wondering about.
And I would offer to you that situation would probably be exceptionally rare. This last year there were only 3 cases out of about 700 some where a credible report, they didn't move the person because there wasn't a credible report. Like I said, it's very, very rare. And that, if you'd like to look at this is the data from the Sapper report is here, and that information about the categories is on the last page right before tab 6, and you can see all the reasons why people didn't move.
But Lieutenant Stiles, you mentioned that in deciding this, it's also the needs of the member balanced with the needs of the services. And Colonel Prince, you said we want to meet the victim's needs while balancing mission requirement needs. Do the other forces have a same mission requirement need built into there?
Yes, ma'am. For Navy, when the request is made, it goes to our Navy Personnel Command, and they're looking for the fit based on the reasons that the request was made, and also what the needs of the Navy are, and the needs of the sailor professionally going forward. So we don't want to send somebody who's an aviation technician to a surface ship base where they can't work on aircraft. So all those things are looked at by our Navy Personnel Command, and if there's a little bit of trade space there's a discussion with the command to try to find out what the best fit will be both for Navy and for the requesting service member.
Marines the same?
Yes, our victims are encouraged to submit 3 desired preferred locations, understanding, managing expectations. But then within Manpower, their goal is to keep them within their MOS and to put them in a place because they're working with a monitor who has been tracking this Marine throughout their career, and that monitor is providing that overlook to make sure that where they're going is still going to move them forward in their career progression. They make every effort to, again, move a Marine out of their MOS or into a location that would not assist them moving forward.
Army, you're so big you can always find a place, right? Yes. AJ.
I have a couple of questions. One pretty simple, probably. It's a follow-up to a bunch of questions that were asked earlier, but I didn't hear this specific mention, and it probably ties into the retention rate. But is there, in this questionnaire that's being done or survey, is there and I heard said that it's not supposed to affect the career of the person being transferred. Is there a question in there about whether the person feels that it's affected their career? along the way?
So I can't break that out by folks with an expedited transfer, but I do
That's
have
what I mean, people who've taken an expedited transfer.
Yeah. No, in general, I have a question that says that that goes to the folks that that said they experienced sexual assault in the past year, and the question is did you take any active steps to separate, or did you think about separating? And that information is in our Workplace and Gender Relations Survey, and I can provide that back to the committee.
It would seem to me extremely important, because one of the criteria we heard on, is it Rangosis? Rangosis, I'm sorry. And by the way, I want to thank you all, extremely valuable, for coming here. It seems to me it would be important to know retention rates may reflect whether they think their career was hurt, but as somebody else said, it may also reflect that just the nature of the sexual assault may want to make them separate. But it would seem to me to tie in whether they think their career has been affected would be extremely important for the expedited transfer request to know.
It is, and so like I said, I do have some data that talks about their career. Vast majority of the folks that go through an expedited transfer say that their experience with their living situation is about the same or better. With their support, their medical and mental health care is about the same or better. Their career progression, a little bit less than the other things, but like I said, we'll get you that data. The challenge is that the number of people in the expedited transfer bucket is about 700 folks every year, versus the several thousand people that may have experienced a sexual assault and not reported it and not gone through the process. And so as a result, my numbers in the survey get a little fuzzy, so it's hard to run that.
I have one totally unrelated question, probably for Mr. Rosen. The number of unrestricted reports requesting transfer in the Navy are 3 times or twice as high as some of the other services. Is that because of the nature of the Navy, people are on ships, or do you know why it's so much higher?
No, sir, I don't. We run somewhere between 28 and 30% of our unrestricted reports end up in an expedited transfer request. Some of that probably does have to do with the expeditionary nature of how we do business, particularly if there is a victim that is looking at ongoing services and support. And if they're on a ship that's either getting ready to deploy or on deployment, that may drive that number up, but that's just speculation on my part.
Because it's 3 times as high as the Air Force and more than twice as high as the Army, and still 50% more than the Marine Corps. Does anybody have any ideas why that is?
Ms. Cannon, you wanted to ask a question?
No, I'm passing.
Okay. Do you break out the requests by the nature of the complaint, whether it's a penetrative or non-penetrative offense? Do we know?
No.
The Air Force does not.
Does not, or you don't have it?
Does not break it out.
Okay, Army?
To my knowledge, no, we don't break it out either.
Coast Guard?
We do not, ma'am.
Not with this, within this process, no.
And Navy?
Same with Navy. I'm sure we have more questions. Yes, okay, over here. Dean Harrison.
As I understand the definition of a transfer, in a large command, it could be moving a person from upstairs to downstairs, or from one side of the base to the other, or I guess theoretically on an aircraft carrier, not even off the boat. But the goal of this is to minimize the encounters between the victim and the alleged accuser. Do you have any data on how many times a person is not really geographically moved but considered transferred?
I do, in a very general sense. I have numbers about how often that they go. They result in a PCS move, an installation transfer, versus basically a unit or a duty transfer. But I don't have anything back underneath that. But essentially, there were 62 requests for unit or duty transfers. That would be kind of a PCA or across the base move or a different unit move. And then in 2016, there were 684 requests for installation transfers.
Okay, so the victim decides what level they want to be transferred?
Oftentimes, that's part of their request.
Okay, do you keep count as to, is a transfer considered to be granted when a victim requests a PCS move and is given basically a intra-base move?
I don't think so, largely because if they've requested a PCS move and that doesn't satisfy their need at that time, then that's a reason that they could appeal to the next to the general officer next in the chain.
Lieutenant Stiles, I have a question for you about the Coast Guard. And I know the Coast Guard is not part of DOD, but the 72-hour action timeline does apply to the Coast Guard. Did I hear you correctly that your decision-making line is 2 weeks?
It's 2 weeks for us to make a decision. That's what's written into our policy, but we find that the timeline is a lot faster in actual processing of these
Or does
requests.
the statute require 72 hours, or is that just DOD policy?
That's upon reporting to it, for us to receive the actual request.
And
So once it comes to PSC, we have up to 2 weeks to adjudicate the request, and sometimes it does take us time because we may have to go back to the command. Let's say we don't know where the confirmed support network is, or we want to engage with through the Sarc to find the best fit for the member with their career progression. So that may take some time, but most of the time we're processing these requests within a few days.
And your office is part of the Commandant's office, isn't it, or
No,
part
we are
of the Coast Guard headquarters?
We are geographically located at Coast Guard headquarters, but the Personnel Service Center we are our own unit. So we fall under the Human Resources CG1.
I'm just trying to understand the structure. If you deny, whose command is making that decision, and who's the next flag officer?
So we have our own flag officer at the Personnel Service Center. And then, so the next flag officer in that chain of command will make a recommendation. So let's say it's a denial. It'll go to that victim's next flag officer, so it could be at a district. That request will then be sent to the personnel, to PSC. PSC Admiral will then review it and make a determination at that time.
Thank you.
Dr. Markowitz.
Dr. Galbraith, I very much appreciate having this data, but obviously Coast Guard is not reflected in the data. So a very simple question, do we have the ability to get from you for the Coast Guard similar data about expedited transfer numbers and denials?
I think we provided the...
Did I just miss it?
There should be, we had, I believe it's 18 different in the attachments that were provided. And there was one instance of a denial that should have been annotated within there. And that had to deal with an unrestricted report where the command was reviewing an investigation regarding the victim's own misconduct at the time that was not related to the sexual assault. The victim was being processed separated from the Coast Guard. And the alleged perpetrator was a civilian who lived in Michigan, and the victim was receiving support services in Florida. So that was...
Thank you, I appreciate it, and I apologize for missing it.
Major Anderson, you had your hand up too.
Yes, my question is kind of personnel related. Most of you were pretty helpful in describing your processes and procedures for processing these transfers. My question goes to, and I'm assuming everybody flags somebody if it's an accused who's going to be transferred. My question relates to how many people will have access to that information, because while you say that the commander is going to be notified that they're getting someone who's been as a result of an expedited transfer and that they've been accused of sexual assault. My experience is there may be other people who have access to that information in the unit. So this kind of goes to how we maintain confidentiality, what kind of internal controls and processes we have in place to assure that happens.
So for Navy, to clarify, we don't flag personnel records of subjects of sexual assault investigations. However,
Either the victim or the accuser are not, they're not flagged.
Nobody's record is flagged. We never flag records of victims. So if a sexual assault, if a service member is accused of a sexual assault and an investigation is ongoing, that command is responsible for ensuring that our personnel command is aware of it if that particular sailor happens to be up for orders at that time, either if they have orders in hand that they're going to be transferring at some point in the future, or the personnel command is working on future orders because it's their normal rotation date. It would be that command that contacts personnel command to say, put that person on hold while we take care of this issue and figure out what the outcome of that is going to be. So I just wanted to clarify, at no time in the personnel system is a record flagged for a subject or victim ever. And I don't know if that answers your question about how our process works.
Okay.
For you, I don't know about the rest of them.
Yeah.
So for the Air Force, I had said that I would get back to the committee. I wasn't sure exactly what the gaining commander receives in terms of information about the alleged offender. But my office works very closely with the Air Force Personnel Center, and I can tell you that the director of the Air Force Personnel Center and one other person has access to information. So they keep this very close hold and very restricted to no more than 2 people.
Okay.
For the Coast Guard, the files are not flagged for the victim or the alleged perpetrator. When you look in our personnel system, which is PSC has control over, it only shows up as a PCS transfer within the system. That'll be a date and unit change, and that will be it for it. And as far as the confidentiality of the case, that's being briefed from with the Sapper sit to the senior command officials. So you're talking about your COs of the units have that knowledge.
Ma'am, for the Army, the victim also is not flagged. As far as what the file looks like for the subject, I would have to get in touch with HRC and get more details for you. I'm not aware of that.
And Marines?
Marines?
And for the Marines, the victims are never flagged. And I will need to go back and get into the details as far as who has access to those records. I believe there is commander review in order to, I will need to go back and get clarification as to who has access to those records.
If I could follow up on that, does that mean for all of you that if, for example, someone is the subject of a credible sexual assault allegation, there's nothing done, for example, with a security clearance?
That may be, sir, in Navy, that's a different issue altogether.
Okay, wouldn't that affect where they would be assigned, or?
Well, you're talking about as they are a subject of an ongoing investigation?
Yes.
Okay, so in Navy, it would be atypical for a subject to be moved anyway, other than within the same chain of command, maybe as I mentioned before, from a squadron to a wing level. That doesn't mean that they wouldn't have necessarily their clearance suspended, or they would be down armored if they carry a weapon. Those things are up to the command from an operational perspective, kind of outside the personnel realm.
But if their file is not flagged, how is all of this information exchanged, and how are these things accomplished?
Well, the individual is in the unit that they were in when the accusation was made, and the commanding officer of that unit is aware of it.
So it's the same command.
So just to clarify, there is a process by which most of the MCIOs, the military criminal investigative organizations, formally notify a command that an individual is under investigation. That commander is then responsible for making determinations as to special program access, arming, and anything else that's going on, personnel reliability program, all that kind of stuff. So that's different from flagging a record.
For the alleged victim, do we have any knowledge or data on the possible abuse of this transfer program, where they ask for an expedited transfer basically just to get an assignment? And we talk so much about it's up to the commander to make these decisions, and for each branch of service, do you know what type of training we provide to that commander to assist them in making these decisions?
So the data with regard to making a false allegation to get an expedited transfer, I don't have any direct information, but what I can tell you is the rates of cases that are determined to be unfounded are no different, really maybe a percentage point or two, then between cases that receive an expedited transfer than cases that don't receive an expedited transfer. And that's some of the data that I'll be bringing with us back in January so that you all can see that. So cases going forward in the system, what I do is, I don't know if you remember, or if you were awake last time when I was walking through the different the waterfall charts of how cases go forward. I can do that for cases that did not receive an expedited transfer versus cases that do receive an expedited transfer. And you can see for yourself the percentage of cases in each of those categories of where cases go forward or don't, at the rate, and they're really largely identical, almost, but within a percentage point or two. So I'll bring that back to you, and you can look for yourself.
Ms. Garvin, I know you've been trying to get in there for a bit.
That's okay. Dr. Galbraith, did I understand you correctly in saying that if a victim has asked for a particular type of transfer, but a different transfer is awarded, that would be considered a denial?
I think that they would be able to appeal that and go forward. I have one case, I think a couple of cases in here, just two, where there's two from the Marine Corps where they offered a PCA instead of a PCS, or in other words, an across the base move versus an installation move. And then there's one from the Air Force where it says the victim was placed in a different organization and squadron with victim approval. And so I do believe, though, that if the victim doesn't get, there's nothing that, let me put it this way, there's nothing in our policy that says if you didn't get the request met, that you could not go forward and ask for an appeal on that.
Okay. Do any other branches know anything, operate differently than that?
The Air Force, that's consistent for the Air Force.
Mm-hmm. And then, Mr. Rosen, you had mentioned I believe for the Navy that it's not a request for an appeal, it's an automatic appeal. When you were pointing out some differences?
Right, so if the initial request to the commanding officer is denied, the OSD policy is the victim has the ability to then submit a subsequent request to the first flag officer. That process is automatic in Navy. It automatically gets transferred up to the first flag officer.
And are you aware of the policy reason why the Navy chose to make that automatic?
When we were implementing the guidance from OSD, we just felt like that was the right thing to do, to ensure, first of all, we had flag visibility on these decisions that were being made, and also to take the onus off the victim of having to request it again.
I just want to follow up on Chief McKinley's question about training, because Ms. Reed, you said that you had, I believe, recently included in pre-command training for your officers, whether giving or receiving, about the expedited transfers. Is the Navy doing any kind of pre-command training, including the expedited transfer issue?
Yes, ma'am. That is incorporated into our PCO, PXO course, pre-commanding officer, pre-executive officer course. When they assume command, the triad, that's the commanding officer, the executive officer, and the senior enlisted, also get a brief from their sexual assault response coordinator that goes over their toolkit and some of the local policies and processes. So that training occurs at that point as well.
And is that also the case then for the Air Force?
Yes, ma'am. That's also the case for the Air Force. Training occurs at pre-command training down at Air University at Maxwell Air Force Base for our commanders. In addition, within 30 days, the sexual assault response coordinators must provide additional training for commanders when they report to their base upon assumption of command. And in addition to that, when any type of when a CMG is convened, there's additional training that is provided to those commanders that are part of the
training includes
It includes expedited transfer. Yes, ma'am.
Same for Coast Guard?
Ma'am, I would have to get back to you on that.
And the Army?
Yes, they meet, yes, with the Sarcs within the 30 days taking the command. And so they meet with their Sarc and receive training.
Ma'am, I just wanted to add that part of the DOD, in the DOD instruction 6495.02, part of the pre-command training standards is training on the expedited transfer.
And if I may follow up on both the training part, but it's related to, let me see, Rangusis? Yes, sorry, Ms. Rangusis, I wrote it down, I was hoping I'd get it. It's related to both training, and then you had flagged in the materials that we had received regarding the expedited victim transfers, the items that commanders shall directly counsel service members about. And there are 4 things in small letters there. And the first one is reasonably foreseeable career impacts. And I'm just curious how commanders are trained on these pieces in order to directly counsel service members, particularly in light of the fact that we're not sure we have data on career impacts. I'm just wondering, so it's a two-part question. Generally, how are commanders trained on these four things, both in terms of content for those subparts and then in method of counseling, because that's the word that's used, and then specifically with regards to subpart A, how that's done in light of we're not sure we have data on career impacts.
Well, I can tell you that I cannot speak specifically to how it's done because we only set the standard to the DoD level. I think the intent behind when we wrote that part of the policy was if victims were in a particular school, how that would affect it. As victims are going through a crisis moment and they want to leave the area, it's up to the commander to explain to them that maybe a slot in that particular school won't be available for some time. There's also victims in a very narrow duty area, intelligence roles or things like that. There are only so many positions, and if you are PCSing out of cycle, those positions are more difficult to get at. Or again, if you have a military spouse, getting two spouses together in the same location at their required duty area is difficult. So I think that was the intent behind the policy, that when somebody is going through a crisis moment, they're talking to their victim advocate, they're going through all the things that they need, that somebody kind of sits them down and say, I know that you want to expedite transfer, I know that you're going through this, but these are the potential impacts to your career. Some victims also have particular duty stations where they get a bonus for accepting that job. So any kind of impact on that bonus if they now decide to leave. So that was the intent behind that. In terms of specific training, we only have the general training requirement.
I think we have time for one last question. Judge Briswell, you haven't had a chance to speak yet.
I don't like the sound of my own voice. So.
We do.
Let me just wrap up here with the question regarding the training. You've all said you get pre-command training, you get assumption of command training, but what no one has said is what is the extent, the scope, the length of that training? What's the quantity and quality of that training? The reason I'm asking is, as a former judge advocate myself, I would do law of war training for new commanders, and I was given all of 30 minutes, and then never saw them again. So you can see where the conundrum comes, or the curiosity comes from.
I think I would defer to services.
Okay, thanks. So you're right. There's an awful lot of training, particularly pre-command. They pack it in pretty tightly. So there's a sexual assault prevention response module. Part of that training in that module is the expedited transfer policy, among the many other things related to the program that we expect our commanding officers and our executive officers and senior enlisted to have. There's the in-brief when they assume command. And I will tell you that a key component of that in-brief is for the sexual assault response coordinator to begin establishing that personal relationship with the commanding officer, because they're the expert and resource. A sexual assault event in a unit is pretty unique. There will be commands that never experience one in the tenure of a commanding officer, and larger commands may have several. But we don't expect them to be off-the-cuff experts, but we do expect them to know what procedures to take immediately, obviously, to support the victim, and if it's an unrestricted report, to begin the notification to the MCIO and investigation, and to reach out to the resources, the Sarc or the victim advocate, the staff judge advocate, who are the experts that can come in and advise them of what their responsibilities are and how to best execute them. So that's probably more than you wanted, but the reality is you're right. There's a lot of information, and sometimes it needs to be just in time. If they know where to go to get it, that may be sufficient for their needs at that point.
So just to summarize or paraphrase what you just said, that the gist of the training is these are issues you might face, these are where you go to resource and staff that issue. It sounds like.
That's part of it, but part of it will be an immediate understanding of what your responsibilities would be to a reporting victim. That is something that we expect them to walk away with and have that knowledge.
I would concur with that. We actually conducted our commander's course Cornerstone for the Marine Corps. Sapper is provided a 3-hour window in which to provide training for them. It was shunted down to an hour and a half just this most recent event, but they were afforded another opportunity to come back on Monday, so they will, they recognize that the hour and a half wasn't covering the time needed. I believe with respect to, a commander needing training on how to address a Marine's career progression, that's outside of Sapper. That is a commander's role to be aware of who his Marines are, or who his or her Marines are, and then to facilitate and enable them to progress forward in their career. That is outside of Sapper's window, and it just is part of their being a commander, and it's just included, in the policy as a reminder that this is something you should also take into consideration when you sit down with your victim, with your Marine who has requested an expedited transfer. Our Sarcs are well versed as well, to be able, again, it's building that resource brief is there to build that rapport and to lock on with that resource, so that you have your immediate response, and then who your circle of support are, to make sure that the services are continuous and relative.
So, sir, for the Air Force, yes, we are challenged with time as well. So we've invested in hiring curriculum design experts to help us figure out strategies that would take adult learning and put it into a small window of time, make sure that our commanders can walk away with the no-kidding takeaways for them to at least get started, because they will always have opportunities for that just-in-time training from the Sarcs. So we do use application-based scenarios for the pre-command training so that they can have examples of what their roles and responsibilities would be. In addition to that, we provide information ahead of time, so they walk out with packets and flow charts and reference materials that they can refer to at a later time. But we are using these curriculum design experts to help us get the core information and training that they need in a small amount of time. So that's a continuous improvement work that we are doing with our training aspect for Sapper in general, but especially for our commanders. And then relative to commanders being trained on career, I will say, and if I can just be a little bit subjective, I'm most proud of the Air Force's ability to with career development and professional development. Commanders have access to chief enlisted managers who are well versed at making sure that our enlisted force have professional development, so that commander can always reach out to the chief enlisted manager for assistance there, whether it's PME or special duty. On the officer side, as well as the enlisted side, we have functional managers. I talked about vertical integration. We have functional career managers at the unit level, at the major command level, at the headquarters level. So that commander has a lot of resources to assist him or her in building that career path and helping to communicate the impacts on the career. So I think the Air Force does a pretty good job with that.
I'll say with the Coast Guard, I can't specifically speak to the individual training because I don't have knowledge about that, but the Coast Guard has a very active training regiment for all Coasties to educate on this. And as far as to the commanders, the PSC provides a central point for commanders to go to ask questions. My role as a CAC is to answer those questions, to field those questions. If they're not sure how the policy is working, we have a very forward-leaning message in going out to the fields and saying that we're here to answer your questions. We want to be, your call center, so to speak, to call us and try to work through these challenging issues.
And I would say for the Army, I can't speak to the exact details of the scope, the length of the training that they receive on expedited transfers, but we do have a dedicated SHARP Academy who is made of curriculum developers like the Air Force mentioned, and they do work on all of the training in the adult learning theories. In addition, I know they've been working on some initiatives that are commander specific. I don't have the details on all the different types of curriculums that they teach for commanders, but they have been designing commander specific curriculums to help them with how they handle this. And I also want to echo that the 30-day meeting that the commander has with the Sark is to go over different things, and also in the Army to build that rapport as well.
So it's
I want to
similar.
thank everybody for coming, Ms. Massey, Lieutenant Stiles, Colonel Prince, Ms. Reed, Mr. Rosen, Ms. Rangusis, and Dr. Galbraith. Thank you so much for your time, your expertise in answering our questions, and we will be on a 10-minute recess. So we
Thank you. I was told there would be no
More from the Defense Advisory Committee on Sexual Assaults in the Armed Forces, with remarks by military attorneys on their experiences representing clients of sexual assault and what can be done to improve victim counseling programs. This is an hour and a half.
I walked from the train station.
So we're starting our Special Victims Counsel, Victim Legal Counsel's perspectives on expedited transfer policy and the program itself. I want to welcome everybody. As we did with the last panel, I'd like to hear what you all have to say, and then we'll open it up to questions from the committee members. You are in control of your destinies as to how you choose in what order to proceed.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Major Simone Jaff. I have served as an active duty judge advocate for the U.S. Army for over 8 years. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. The opinions I express today are my own, based on my experience, and are not those of the Army. As a judge advocate, I have been a legal assistance attorney, administrative law attorney, trial counsel, which is an Army term for prosecutor, and most recently a special victims counsel. As a trial counsel from June 2012 to May 2014, I prosecuted sexual assault cases. I served as a full-time special victims counsel from March 2015 to July 2017 at Fort Hood, Texas. I'm currently in the process of earning my LLM at the Army's Judge Advocate Legal Center and School in Charlottesville, Virginia. The role of an SVC is to represent victims of sexual assault. As attorney for a sexual assault victim, special victims counsels ensure their client is fully educated about their rights and services available to them in the justice processes, whether it be in the military realm or the civilian realm. Special victims counsels provide effective and timely advice and support to clients during this time. Victims are entitled to special victim counsel representation whether the client has chosen to make a restricted or unrestricted report. Both reporting options allow victims to receive the necessary services to cope with the assault. Only the unrestricted option requires an investigation. Victims are entitled to special victim counsel representation at any point in the process, meaning an attorney-client relationship can be formed soon after a report is made or the day before trial. I typically became involved as soon after a report was filed. Because special victims counsel zealously and appropriately advocate in the best interest of their client, special victims counsels are independent of the investigative, prosecution, and defense offices. Special victims counsels advocate for the best interests of their clients. Therefore, there are times when those interests were not aligned with those of the prosecution. The defense and the client may agree on an issue, or the victim may decline to participate. During my time as an SVC, I served as a senior special victim counsel, which meant that in addition to my own caseload, I supervised other SVCs. At Fort Hood, we had between 3 to 4 full-time special victims counsels that served on average for 18 months. Over the course of my tenure, I supervised 8 full-time special victims counsel and represented 77 clients. I currently have 6 clients whose cases are now post-trial. At any one time, on average, I had 30 clients whose cases were at different stages in the investigative and disposition processes. The cases ran the gamut from abusive sexual contact to sexual assault. I had adult clients as well as minor clients. I had dependents as clients. The majority of my clients were current or former service members. The majority of my clients were also female. I had 8 clients who requested expedited transfers. Some came to Fort Hood, left Fort Hood, or transferred units within the installation. Those that hadn't received a transfer prior to becoming my client came to me seeking information and advice on the process. In discussing the process with the client, I explained the process, the pros and cons of a transfer, and the roles of the parties involved. In the expedited transfer process, I mostly advised my client and talked to commanders and/or victim advocates if necessary. In my experience, all of my clients who requested a transfer received it. For 7 out of the 8 clients, the expedited transfer process went smoothly and occurred in a timely fashion. One client had an issue that was resolved after speaking to the company commander. Once my clients made their moves, I didn't have any clients report that they experienced any issues moving forward in their new unit and/or their career. After transfer, all of my clients continued to cooperate with investigators and the prosecution. I do believe that the Special Victim Counseling Program is beneficial to victims of sexual assault. I've had clients tell me that they appreciated having someone who could explain things to them without the limitations that a prosecutor has. That someone was available to them more often than not. Depending on the particular case, having a buffer between them and investigators, the prosecution, and defense, as well as a filter for information and requests, as well as a sounding board that minimize the stress and confusion. I enjoyed my time as a Special Victim Counsel and believe it is an interesting, educational, and important assignment. I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lieutenant Commander Claire Huffstetler, and I'm currently the Victims Legal Counsel for Naval District Washington. I've been serving as the Naval District Washington VLC since July 2016, so approximately 15 months. Prior to this billet, I served as the Command Judge Advocate on 3 separate aircraft carriers, and also the Command Judge Advocate for Naval Station Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Prior to those duties, I served as a defense counsel from 2010 to 2013, and concurrently served as a PEB department head and also respondents counsel in formal PEB proceedings in front of the Corp. I have served over the course of my 15 months 49 VLC clients. My average caseload is approximately 34 clients, between 30 and 40 clients, I would say, and I currently have 34 clients. There's no typical case. That's something that I want the board to understand. Every single case that we see is different. The facts are different, the commands are different, and the needs of the individual are different. And as such, there's no typical point that I receive a client in any case. It could be before the case has even been reported to law enforcement. It could be at the point where the client has already made a statement. And I have even had a case where the client was getting ready to go on the stand and decided that they needed legal representation. I absolutely think that the VLC program has been beneficial to victims of sexual assault. I receive very positive feedback from my clients. They tell me that they understand the process and that they have someone to call when they're overwhelmed and anxious about this legal process and about their personal legal liability. A cornerstone of my relationship with my clients involves expectation management. I attempt to alleviate their anxiety revolving around the legal process. They have extreme anxiety about the future, about their participation in the legal process, and about their legal liability if they choose to go forward. The clients are worried about this universe of unknowns. And I can give my client a target set of issues to worry about. You should worry about this, this, and maybe not that. The unknown specter. And it actually does help them, and I receive positive feedback from my clients. The feedback I often receive is that the client could not have gone forward through the criminal justice process. In some cases, they would not have executed their report to NCIS, and they would have not endured the legal process in their local commands but for having their own legal advocate separate from the prosecution staff. In many ways, the VLC program is an added benefit to retention and to readiness within the commands. On one hand, by focusing my clients' attention on their jobs and away from the anxiety about the process, I keep them ready. I can empower my clients to do their jobs even in times where they're going through legal proceedings, because I'm there to explain the process to them, and I'm also there to interface with all the other agencies that are trying to take away from their time at their job. On the other hand, when it's clear that the client is not, in fact, suitable for continued service, or they're struggling significantly in their jobs due to medical conditions or psychological conditions, I can also advise my client about the best resources that are available. I'm not a doctor, so I tell my clients very often, please go see counseling services, go see the chaplain, and I can give them advice on the implications of that medical treatment and care and how it will relate to their case going forward and how it will affect them if they end up on the stand. Taking away that anxiety about that aspect of the case allows them to get past the barriers to treatment. I can also shepherd them to the right processes for medical boards and administrative separation boards in ways that will be beneficial to that client. When the client gets to the right process or resource early in a timely fashion, that's best for them, that's best for their commands, and that's best for the Navy overall, and I get to assist the client in that. What is most beneficial to the clients about having a victim's legal counsel is that they get unbiased legal advice. They get to evaluate and understand and make a voluntary and knowledgeable decision about how they want to handle their case, and that puts the control back in the hands of the client. That's the most important thing I believe about my practice in the VLC program. If my client wants to, after knowing what is in store for them in the process, wants to go forward, I will charge ahead and advocate for their rights in the process. If they decide, however, after hearing what's in store for them in the legal process, that they do not want to go to NCIS, that they do not want to go through the law enforcement process, I will advocate for their rights to not be approached by any of the other stakeholders in the process, in the criminal justice process. I can prevent them from being unduly influenced by either the prosecutor or the defense, or for being shamed for making a decision about not going forward. And as you can imagine, that's a very stressful decision for a victim of a sexual assault to make. But it's a valid decision, and their rights need to be protected. In the expedited transfer process, my role is to advise my clients about the process, to give them the pros and cons about an expedited transfer that's tailored to the facts of their case and to the life and the needs of that sailor or officer. I can also evaluate the personalities of the commanders involved in making that decision, and I can also advise my client on how to make their request in a way that will more likely be accepted, and that their geographic location that they're requesting, that they may actually receive that request. So I'm a helper. I help them communicate to the leadership on making their decisions. I also provide training to victim advocates, to Sarcs, to commands, to the PCOs and PXOs as they go through their schooling before they take command, on how the Sapper process and expedited transfer requests work and what are the criteria to approve or deny those requests. Approximately 1/3 of my clients have requested expedited transfer under my term as a VLC, and most of those requests were approved. I do believe that the expedited transfer process is a vital part of the military justice process. It is absolutely vital and beneficial for the victims to have the ability to exit the command when there is a stigma and when there is a perceived stigma, because the perception of the victim is one of the most important things that's going to determine whether that person goes forward in the process. Their perception of whether they're supported. And this expedited transfer gives them an opportunity to be aligned in a location where they perceive that they are supported. Of the process in place in the Navy, one aspect I would recommend a change is that the expedited transfer orders that come from the Bureau of Personnel, once the client has submitted their request, it's been approved, and it's at the Bureau of Personnel, they're detailed orders. And there are obviously several criteria that the Navy has to look at to determine what orders they get. And I would recommend that the process for expedited transfer orders be as transparent as we have ventured to make our regular detailing process. Although there are some limitations for our Bureau of Personnel just due to the shortened time frame of these expedited transfers. However, I think in the future we could probably move towards a system where the victim knows what billets are available in which geographic locations, and again, that would provide some benefit to their expectation management in this process. Thank you.
I have a PowerPoint, ladies and gentlemen, so if you could just give me a moment while that's being loaded. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Major Jessica Martz. I am the Deputy Officer in Charge for the Victims Legal Counsel Program within the Marine Corps. I thank you so much for this opportunity. And now that my slides are loaded, I will move on. Next slide, please. I'll go ahead and press. First of all, I'd like to talk about our mission. Just like my colleagues in the Army and the Navy have highlighted, the mission of the Victims Legal Counsel Program in the Marine Corps is the same. Our goal is to educate and advocate for victims of sexual assault. The thing that makes us a little bit different, and I know it's not within the purview of this panel, we also represent victims of domestic violence as well. And occasionally we will take on, with exceptional cases, victims of other violent crimes. I'm on slide 3, ma'am. Thank you. We do that to hold everybody accountable. The trial counsel, the defense counsel, the military judges, the commanders. We do that, MCIOs, throughout the investigative process and throughout the military justice process. I've highlighted some of the references that our mission statement is made up of, or made up from, there at the bottom of the slide. Next slide, please, ma'am. First of all, I'd like to start off by saying I've loved my experience as a judge advocate, but I particularly love this job. I've served 4 years in military justice prior to becoming a VLC, and I just left being the Regional Victims Legal Counsel for the National Capital Region down in Quantico, which is similar to the billet that Lieutenant Commander Hofstetler serves for the National District of Washington. I did that from May of 2016 until August. During that time, I assisted over 70 victims. I had 47 detailed clients, meaning I was actually their attorney. Attorney-client privilege was established. In those other cases, I had confidentiality with those victims. My average caseload was about 25 cases, give or take a few more. I supervised other victims' legal counsel in that capacity, and in August, I moved up to Henderson Hall, here in lovely Arlington, Virginia, to serve as the deputy officer in charge for our whole program, like I said. In that capacity, I assist my boss, Lieutenant Colonel Larada, the program manager, in supervision of all the victims' legal counsel. And I also still hold 12 clients from my prior billet as the RVLC. Next slide, please. First of all, I'd like to say, just like everybody has said before, when we take a case, it really depends on when the victim comes to us. I like to kind of jokingly say, we don't ambulance chase. We don't go after victims. They've already been traumatized, so we don't want to chase after them. We count on the DoD mandate that MCIOs and Sapper and FAP and commanders notify the victim of our services, and then we are usually provided a referral through that process. Just like my colleagues have said before, I've had victims come way before they were actually reported, immediately after the assault, all the way until they're about to testify at trial. The goal of our organization, and certainly a goal with respect to expedited transfers, is to educate the victims on this process. They're going to hear about it usually before they get to us, because the Sapper program is going to tell them about it. Their command, their UVAs might tell them about it. But our goal is to make sure that they truly understand that, not just the policies in place, the process, and the other options available. I've heard already discussed the transfer of the accused as an option. Safety transfers are other options. Going on temporary orders away from that location or away from that offender have been discussed. But also, what is the impact on their career? I've heard that also discussed here. We advise them on that. We look at, your MOS. What's your MOS? Is that a small MOS, a low-density MOS? Would you like to change MOSs if you can't get to the location you'd like? In some cases, we've been able to get MOS transfers for victims. It's not a common thing, but if they're willing to do that because they want to go, to a particular location, that has been something that we've been able to work out through the Sapper program. We also advise them on the impact that it's going to have on their case. If the victim is going to move away from where that case is going to be tried, we talk about the pros and cons of that.
Maybe it's better for them. Maybe they're more likely to participate if they go away from where that is, and their VLC works on worrying about the case. We talk about the transfer of the VLC services when we're advising our clients. If I'm in Quantico and you transfer to Camp Pendleton, are you going to want a Camp Pendleton VLC, somebody right there that you can walk into and talk? Or do you want the VLC that's located where the case is going to be tried? Somebody who knows the players, who knows the trial counsel, who knows the defense counsel. It's up to the victim. They make the call, and we honor that request. Finally, with respect to helping victims in expedited transfers, we also sometimes help them with the actual submission of those requests. It's typically the Sapper program in my experience, but sometimes we have assisted them. I've assisted 2 victims directly in their submission because their Sarc was not necessarily somebody that they knew that well, and I was somebody that they knew better. We also will assist them with those appeals that came up with the last panel. So if they're denied their request and they want to appeal that, we will assist them with that, and we will advise them on what the process and procedure is for that. Next slide, please. My personal experience with expedited transfers as a victim's legal counsel, I've inherited 7 cases where one was granted. So the victim was at a different location. They asked for a transfer. It was granted. They come to Quantico or the National Capital Region within my district, and now I'm their victim's legal counsel. I've also assisted with 6 transfer requests. 5 were approved. I will caveat that. I didn't put it on the slide, but I will caveat that in one of those approvals, it did take a discussion between the staff judge advocate advising the commander and myself, because there was a perception that there was a potential for misuse of that process. But with my client's permission, I was able to explain that she wanted to be closer to a support person where she was requesting to go, and it was granted once that was explained. I did have one denied, and that was based on the credible claim standard. I would rather not get into the details of that out of respect for my client, but ultimately she got her goal. She was sent on temporary orders to the location that she requested, so we were able to accomplish her goal via another means outside the expedited transfer process. She was offered the ability to appeal that, but because she was sent TAD where she wanted, we did not end up appealing that. Next slide, please. From my personal perception of my client's experience with the expedited transfers, it has been a very, very positive thing. I will admit that prior to becoming a VLC, I wasn't totally sure about the program, but now that I've worked with victims, I definitely see how beneficial it is to them. It removes them from where this has all happened, potentially, if the assault has happened in that location. It also gets them away from the rumor mill that could happen, even if the offender is not co-located with them. It's not to be used for safety reasons. As I think it's already been stated, that's a safety transfer. That's a different transfer. Expedited transfers, unfortunately, I think are still sometimes used to move the victim away where it's unsafe. That's a misconception, and that's a misuse of the expedited transfer. It's really to get the victim away from that experience, not because of safety reasons. The other thing that benefits victims, they may experience retaliation in the form of ostracism at the command level. That's usually that peer-to-peer, maybe one level up. They don't want to report that, and you can all imagine probably why. When you've already reported a crime, you don't want to report another crime. It's already an experience that you haven't enjoyed, and you don't want to have to go through that again. So one way they're able to get away from that retaliation is to ask for an expedited transfer. Then they don't have to report it, they can just get away from it. Finally, it gives victims a sense of empowerment. And that may seem kind of cliche, but it really does. When somebody has taken away the control from you and assaulting you, it gives you a chance to take control of your life a little bit and get away from that situation. And then finally, like I've discussed before with that one particular example I gave previously, sometimes victims want to move closer to support persons, and that expedited transfer allows them to do that. Next slide, please. Some areas for improvement. The policy can be viewed as contradictory, and I'll give an example. The policy in the Marine Corps, and I think it's consistent with the DoD policy as it stands, is that the victim should provide non-confidential information in their request. However, the commander is required to consider, I believe, 10 factors. One of those goes back to your question, I believe, Ms. Bashford. You asked about the nature and circumstances of the charge. Is that considered? The commander is required to consider that, at least in the Marine Corps. Yet when the victim is only providing non-confidential information, that can be kind of hard to tell. Yes, they're required to pull, from if there's it's obviously an unrestricted case, they're required to pull the unrestricted file if they can from NCIS, and they can gain details from that. But if the burden is a little bit on the victim, I think that can be contradictory, not just for the victim, but for the commander as well. I think that's a difficult position to put the commander in, to ask him or her to analyze all these factors when the victim's only going to tell you so much. And that's where that one case that I described, the caveat case, out of the 5 approvals, the one commander just needed more information, and the staff judge advocate and I were able to discuss that, and then the commander was able to reach a decision in her favor. There's also an issue still with perceptions, and I'm sure that's probably why we're all here. There is a perception still out there. I don't think it's the majority of Marines, but I think there's still a perception out there that transfers are being used outside its intended purpose. So, one example would be, well, the victim just wants to get out of that duty station. They want to go from, let's say, Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, in lovely Jacksonville, North Carolina, to the sunny beaches of Miramar or Camp Pendleton, California. The other thing, which was, I think, highlighted by you, Ms. Tokash, yes, ma'am, I think it could hinder the prosecution of the case. So the defense might want to use that as a motive to fabricate. The victim will come forward and say that they're sexually assaulted so that they can get to a better duty station. I think that perception is still out there. I think anybody that works with the victim knows how untrue that would be, that somebody would put themselves through telling their story so many times just to get transferred to a different duty station instead of just waiting out where they're at. I've been to Camp Lejeune for 5 years. It's not that bad if you go to the Outer Banks. So, everybody finds a way to make it all work. I really do think overall, in closing, that the Victims Legal Counsel program is extremely beneficial. I just want to close with one quick story. I was actually just telling somebody who taught me how to be a UVA back in 2006 this story, but I think this is a very illustrative story. The first time I went to a trial with a client, we went to help her rehearse for her testimony inside the courtroom, and long story very short, she didn't like the idea of getting on that stand. So we were able to come up with a way where she could still hold her offender accountable outside the court-martial process through an administrative proceeding. They were able to get a deal from the defense. The defense came with a deal. The trial counsel presented it to my client, and they said, "Here you go." And I thought to myself in that moment, before there was a VLC or an SVC sitting next to this victim, that victim was going to have to figure out what was in that document by themselves, or the trial counsel would hopefully explain it to them. But that's our job. Our job, and what I did is I took that document, we excused ourselves, and I explained exactly what that document meant. So I hope there's never any doubt that Victims Legal Counsel and SVCs do provide a very valuable service to these victims who are very young and who don't know the legal process and might never have heard any of these terms. So I really thank you for your time. I think that it's a program that should never go away, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you. And that's our handsome faces at CAF a few weeks ago.
Captain Tull.
Good afternoon. My name is Captain Brittany Tedford. I'm the Special Victims Counsel at Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina, and I have been in that position since July of 2016. Overall, we in the Air Force SVC program have found expedited transfers to be a life-saving, positive benefit for our clients, and we endorse the ET program. My goal today is to share my perspective on the program, how my clients have benefited from it, the impact that it has had, speaking from the benefit of my own experience, as well as the input that I've received from my fellow Air Force SVCs. I would first like to talk about the SVC's role in the ET process. The Sarcs and commanders own the process, but the SVCs play an important role. We advocate for our clients' interests, which often means educating and informing commanders throughout the process in order to get them to support our clients' goals. We will help explain to commanders why our client wants an ET in the first place, what the ET will be expected to do for the client, and how the ET will benefit the unit and the Air Force as a whole. Victims ask for transfers for a variety of reasons, including to get physically closer to their families or other support system, to get away from the subject, especially in cases where the subject may be a supervisor or in the chain of command, to separate themselves from other airmen who may gossip or discuss the case, especially in cases where many members of the same unit are involved, and to have the opportunity for a fresh start away from the physical location where the assault occurred. I'd like to give an overview of what I would consider the typical case where an active duty airman requests a transfer. Normally, they make the unrestricted report with the Sarc office, which is where they learn about the option to request an ET, as well as SVC services. After I get detailed and establish an attorney-client relationship with the client, I coordinate with OSI to schedule the initial victim interview and attend that interview with the client. Following the interview, the client considers the pros and cons of requesting the ET, both for their life and for the case. These may include starting over in a new location but having to leave a base that they may like, possible cross-examination questions at trial by defense counsel, and potential career implications of that decision. If the client decides to request it, they put in the official request in our online personnel system, where they list up to 3 bases and provide justification as to why they want to go to those locations. All of my clients have requested bases that are close to their families or to other support systems. Their justifications focus on their well-being and starting over away from the subject and other airmen who may know about the sexual assault. I have not found that my clients are trying to get to what are generally considered highly desirable locations, such as Hawaii or Italy. For example, I have had clients transfer from Shaw to Dyess Air Force Base in Abilene, Texas, McConnell Air Force Base in Kansas, and Moody Air Force Base in Valdosta, Georgia. Not that those aren't great locations. Once it is officially requested, ETs get involved by having meetings and telephone calls with commanders to advocate for approval of the ET. In my discussions with commanders, they want to know that the client has fully thought through the implications of their decision, and they rely on the SVCs to really educate them about the ET process and the military justice process from the victim's perspective specifically. This indicates to me that the commanders are trying to balance my client's well-being and career, trying to understand the process, and trying to do what they believe is the right thing for the client and for the Air Force. We acknowledge that commanders have a difficult task in balancing the mission and the victim's needs, and thus we emphasize the critical importance of the ET for a victim's recovery and often retention in the Air Force. An airman forced to remain in a hostile or threatening environment will not remain a productive airman, and commanders are often receptive to such an appropriately framed ET. If it is approved, it goes to the Air Force Personnel Center, and it usually takes between a month to 2 months, sometimes less, for them to actually leave the base and move to their new duty station. For unusual or unique cases, the SVC takes the lead role in coordinating with AFPC and crafting solutions. The transfers and the OSI investigations run concurrently, which minimizes any potential investigative impact. The local OSI detachment will continue to run the investigation after the client moves bases. I have had cases where there are minor follow-up questions needed, and we set that up via teleconference with the investigators. I have not seen a negative impact to the case processing through the military justice system caused by the client being at a different base. And all of my clients who have transferred from Shaw have traveled back to Shaw for the Article 32 hearing and for trial. Although ETs have many benefits to the victims who request them, I want you to know that ETs are rarely a complete panacea for all of the challenges facing a sexual assault victim. In some cases, the ET can actually introduce new problems for the victims, and the victims, with the help of their SVCs, carefully consider where the benefits of the ET are outweighed by the costs. Additionally, the client must weigh the potential career implications, as we've discussed today. Many of our airmen have been trained on a specific airframe or have a job that is available at a limited number of bases. This creates a challenge because in smaller career fields, many of the people within that career field could also be involved in the case, or the client may fear that if they stay within that career field, they may be later reassigned back with the subject. Because of these concerns, the client, with the SVC's help, can request to cross-train. This may be a difficult decision for a client to leave a career field that they may have spent years training in and feel a connection to. In my view and experience, echoed by the input that I got from my fellow Air Force SVCs, abuse of the ET program is not prevalent. I have not had the experience where I have felt like a client is gaming the system in order to obtain an ET. In fact, the majority of my clients did not know that the expedited transfer system exists until the Sarc briefed them on it when they were actually making the unrestricted report. My perception is that my clients have requested the transfer have done so to be close to their family or other support system, and I believe that these motivations are genuine. Before they put the request in, we discussed the pros and cons, the career impacts, and how the transition may be more difficult than they think. A great deal of thought and discussion goes into the client's decision to put in the request. Finally, as attorneys, we are ethically bound to act in good faith, and we cannot facilitate a request if we know it's being made fraudulently. SVCs have been integral in advocating to and working with Sarcs, OSI, commanders, our base legal offices, and the Air Force Personnel Center to best serve our clients in order to support and assist with their healing, recovery, and rehabilitation. We have found the Expedited Transfer program to be a positive, valuable program for our clients. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Commander Paul Markland, and I'm a Coast Guard Special Victims Counsel stationed in Cleveland, Ohio. I was commissioned a little over 21 years ago, and since then I also served as trial counsel, defense counsel, staff judge advocate, and trial counsel, defense counsel, and staff judge advocate. I received my initial SVC training and certification in 2014, and I've represented 33 victim clients, 13 of whom have ongoing cases. Regarding my perspective on the Victims Counsel program generally, I can tell you that it's the most personally satisfying work I've done as a judge advocate. Back when I was litigating regularly, I remember watching sexual assault victims on the stand and thinking that the government has its lawyers, the accused has lawyers, but if anyone really needs one now, it's the victim. To me, the program's most beneficial aspect has been that it curbs that unintentional and intentional victim bullying that unfortunately had become customary in the military justice proceedings. The most problematic aspect of the program I see is our current need to fill SVC positions with new judge advocates, because they're expected to be the victim's expert on the system before they've experienced any of the system's competing interests. I'm confident that as our program evolves, we'll be able to improve it with SVCs who know what it's like to prosecute and defend in courts-martial. I always mention the Expedited Transfer program to new clients, but usually they already heard about it when they first made their sexual assault report. So far, I've had 5 clients who wanted expedited transfers. I put in requests for all 5. Their commands recommended approval for all of them, and they were all granted to the client's satisfaction and within policy guidelines. From my perspective, the request process in the Coast Guard is simple. If clients are interested, I talk to them about whether the reason for requesting a transfer fits the policy. If they express a fear of retaliation or a desire to be closer to family support or some other distant support network or any other pertinent reason, then we collaborate on a request. After confirming the reason for transferring, I ask clients to write a short email intended for their command that says in their own words why they want an expedited transfer and where they prefer to go. I have them send it to me first so I can forward it with more of a legal justification that connects the client's narrative to the policy. Then I attach a copy of the policy and send it to the command, and I copy the command servicing legal office and the Sarc. After that, the command runs with it. They have to produce a formal recommendation memo that's significantly more comprehensive than the email I sent them. While preparing that over the next few days, they call me with questions, and often with specific transfer proposals, wondering if the client would be okay with a certain job at a certain unit. Those calls indicate to me that the command is already talking with the client's assignment officer at our Personnel Service Center in Washington, D.C., which is where all our transfer orders come from, and it's where the command's recommendation memo is headed. A couple of times at that stage, I've called assignment officers directly to advocate for my client's interests, and they've been open to that discussion. Within 2 weeks of requesting an expedited transfer, my clients have gotten their new orders. After the first time, I've had to warn new clients that it could happen that fast. And they've all remarked that 2 weeks is not a lot of time to prepare for a permanent change of station. But the orders always give them at least another 30 days to execute, and I'm confident we can get even more time if we needed it. We have frequent transfers off the cutter fleet. I've had 3 cases in which clients were assigned to a cutter when they made their sexual assault report, and potentially could have just transferred ashore to the base where the ship ties up. But I don't think that was ever seriously considered. I suspect that's probably because our bases are really small compared to the other services. So the odds are high that the victim and the accused would encounter each other at the gym, at the exchange, at the health clinic, in the galley, in the parking lot, etc. The most populated Coast Guard base is Base Alameda, California, and when all the cutters are in, it's around 2,400 people on a tenth of a square mile of space. I've been there several times, and I don't like my chances of successfully avoiding anyone either stationed there or home ported there. And any two people working there are likely to discover they have overlapping functions. There's only one other base that comes close to that size, and the rest of our populations are much smaller. At any of our installations, a military protective order might prevent interaction, but it doesn't stop an accidental encounter from happening in the first place, which can be very traumatic, and just imagining the likelihood could cause a victim to become hypervigilant instead of focused on duties. In the Coast Guard, victims of any crime are usually not co-located with the prosecutors, so having a complaining witness who needs a plane ticket to show up was typical before there were expedited transfers. None of my expedited transfer clients have resisted cooperation with the prosecution. I haven't had an increase in these requests in the past year. I helped with 2 requests in the past 12 months and 2 in the 12-month period before that. After their transfer, one of my clients' enlistment expired. The rest are still serving in the Coast Guard. I see the fact that they want to continue serving as one of the benefits of expedited transfers. But before their transfer, all of these clients were feeling tormented where they were. I see the ability to quickly rescue them from that as the biggest benefit of the program, and I wholeheartedly recommend its continuation. Everything I just described is my own experience, but I also have some common observations from the other Coast Guard SVCs. Most clients decide not to seek an expedited transfer, and they tend to want to bring as little attention as possible to their situation. The ones who do transfer tend to express sadness about leaving their units, their shipmates, and their homes. The most common reason for requesting the transfer is relief from the distracting and relentless rumor mill that pervades cutters and small boat stations. Clients who don't want to cooperate with the prosecution tend to make that aversion clear regardless of whether they are interested in an expedited transfer. The most common reason for becoming uninterested in the prosecution is because it takes too long. The combined investigation and legal analysis take about 6 months, and that's just getting to a charge sheet. Clients who are already participating in the prosecution tend to continue participating after their expedited transfer. And there are a couple of cases in which clients initially declined prosecution but re-engaged after their expedited transfer because they felt safer without the accused around, and even saw the move as an opportunity to get their careers back on track. Lastly, all of the Coast Guard's SVCs I've heard from favor continuation of the expedited transfer program. Thank you.
Thank you all. Judge Grimm.
Each of you take just a minute or two and give us some more detail about your role as Special Victims Counsel during the actual court proceedings prior to the beginning of the trial and during the court rush. So, for example, if you believe that a improper line of cross-examination would be pursued by defense counsel, do you have the ability during the trial itself to do that? So help us understand how that role works during the actual proceedings in court, the pre-trial and during the trial.
I would say pre-trial, it really just depends on the complexity of the case. And at what point do I get involved in a case? If I've been involved since the beginning of the case, I'm there for every interview between the investigators, criminal investigative division or CID, with the prosecutors themselves. And if my client has agreed to meet with defense counsel, I'm also there when they meet with defense counsel. I'm there for any pre-trial hearings, so any motions, request for continuance, whatever may be in that particular case, I'm there for. As far as the actual trial, I'm there in the courtroom the entire time, and I, on breaks, go out and explain to my client what is going on. I'm there if there's any meetings between the prosecution and the client in preparation for their testimony, if there's issues that come up during trial. If there's any issues during trial, in my particular jurisdiction at Fort Hood, we had to object through the prosecutors so that we would pass notes to the prosecutor and let them know that, hey, you should be objecting at this point. I maybe had to do that one time because our judges and our prosecutors were pretty good at making sure that the defense counsel or prosecution were, defense counsel were following through on whatever issues have been cited pre-trial as far as psychiatric records, rape shield laws, or anything else pertaining to our client that we have decided ahead of time, that had been decided ahead of time. And also prosecution, the judge were very good at making sure that defense counsel were not badgering, harassing the witness. And I will say that happened very rarely with defense counsel. If it did come up, it was mostly with civilian counsel.
So in that process, the pretrial procedure, would that be the most typical time that the Special Victims Counsel and the prosecutor would raise issues about the ability of the defense to raise issues that would be covered under the auspices of Military Rule of Evidence 412, the rape shield rule?
Yes, sir.
Those would be typically litigated pretrial, right?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. That's the intent. However, obviously, sometimes new issues come up at trial for 412 and 513. In the Navy court system, we will stand. Actually, VLCs will sit behind the bar. If we have an objection that applies to the standing of the client, we will stand quietly and wait to be acknowledged by the judge, and we'll usually make our objection outside of the audience of the members. In the Army courtroom, however, you have to make your objection through the prosecutor, which at some points is problematic because the interest of the prosecutor and the interest of the victim may be divergent. And as far as the Navy VLC is concerned, we do answer all the motions prior to trial separately from the trial counsel, although I have joined with the government in my answers.
And when they're argued pre-trial before the military judge, will the military judge direct questions or give an opportunity to hear from the Special Victims Counsel separately from the prosecutor?
Yes, sir.
Great.
Yes, sir.
When we file our motions, we ask for oral argument our motions as a party. So.
Thank you.
So our system, Your Honor, our system mirrors the Navy. We would stand quietly if there was an objection in mid-trial. If a defense counsel were asking my client an improper question, I would stand, I would wait for the judge to acknowledge me, and then I would object on the basis of Article 6B. Our clients have a right to be treated with fairness and dignity, and I would cite that rule. It's stronger than the case law that supports us on that regard, because typically, the case law says we can only object on 412, 513, but Article 6B came after, thank you, Air Force, LRM versus Kastenberg. So we would object on Article 6B, but I would agree with everything that they've said about our interaction before trial with respect to motions. We would argue separately from the government typically, and during trial as well. Sir, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Your Honor. Same in the Air Force. The majority of our issues are handled in pretrial motions, and we are given a separate opportunity to argue. We file written responses as well. Our rules are actually in our uniform rules of practice, but they mirror the Navy and the Marines in that if while our client is testifying, if we need to object, we sit in the gallery. We are to stand and wait to be acknowledged by the military judge, and we usually ask for an Article 39A session, which is a session outside the hearing of the members.
Thank you.
I haven't yet had trouble being recognized either pre-trial or during the trial. And pre-trial, we're typically there in order to argue the motion we filed. It's usually either a 412 or a 513 under the military rules of evidence. And then during trial, actually in our Norfolk courtroom, last couple of cases there, they had set up a third table. So there was a trial counsel table, defense counsel table, and a third table for SVC, and we were in the well. And there's another courtroom where I've had a lot of cases in Alameda, and we're still in the gallery in that courtroom. And the gallery, it's such a small courtroom, and the gallery's up close. I've never had trouble just standing up and everything stops, and they ask what you want. So,
Could collectively you just give me one final thing, and that will be my last question. We're focusing on who we should be hearing from for this committee, and obviously commanders and investigators and the Special Victims Counsel, and it is a pleasure to hear such articulate lawyers who can attest to how meaningful they believe that this role is. Should we be hearing from military judges? They're independent, they're trained, they're not in the same chain of command as the convening authority. That has been established from when I was in the military as a JAG, and that was before any of you were born. So that independence has been around for a long time. But should we be hearing from military judges? Do you believe that the military judges take seriously, because you are a relatively new role in the courtroom, take seriously the ability to allow you meaningful involvement? Or is this not a problem, so we can best spend our time looking elsewhere?
I think it's going to depend on the judge. We've had some judges that are supportive of the program. We've had some judges that don't know how to feel about it. And we've had some judges that have outright told us they don't like us. So I think it would be beneficial just to get those different perspectives and see what way you can get those judges that may not like us to have a little more respect for the program.
Thank you, Major.
Madam Chair, I've got a question that dovetails right on this.
Okay.
So Judge Grimm is the trial judge. I'm a United States Magistrate Judge, so I'm the discovery judge. And something you said, during the discovery phases in federal cases that I preside over, the discoverability of something doesn't necessarily translate to the admissibility of something. So when you fill out on behalf of your clients your request for expedited transfer and you have to describe the event, that's potentially giglio impeaching type materials. Are you getting requests for those materials?
So the Marine Corps policy, sir, is that they're not to provide confidential information.
Well, but the description of the event, if it differs from the report to CID or NCIS, that discrepancy in description of events can lead to potential impeachment lines of questioning. So are you getting requests for those materials?
I haven't seen that request, sir.
Sir, I have, but they're not in the justification. They're justifying why they want to go to these particular locations. I have never seen a client where they have, described all of the facts of the sexual assault in those, and I usually help them write the justifications because I know they're probably going to be discoverable.
Same, sir. In the Navy requests, I think the most time spent on the actual allegation and the facts of the case are, my name is so-and-so, I made an unrestricted report of sexual assault on X date. And that date could pertain to the report to the Sarc or the law enforcement, and that's pretty much the last time we talk about the case. The rest of the letter is spent talking about the personal needs of the sailor or the officer. And yes, those issues in that letter have come up in 412 motions and have been the source of cross-examination and credibility questions later. That's one reason that we scrutinize those letters so closely before we submit them to the command.
I have not had a request.
My position on discovery has always been that neither my client or I have any discovery obligations in the system. Now, after you talk to the client, if they're on board and anything's negotiable, what's in it for us kind of thing. But, typically I point back at the trial counsel and say, talk to him, because we don't have any discovery obligations in the system.
Ms. Long, and then Ms. Cannon, and then Mr. Green.
And Judge Walton.
And Judge Walton.
So thank you very much for your testimony. This entire day has been very, very instructive. This question's a little bit outside the scope of what you talked about, because I'm not sure when we're going to get to ever hear from you all again. But based on your representation of victims, could you each, and knowing that every case is different, could you each tell us what maybe your number one thing your clients have said that they would want out of an investigation or prosecution of a case that would make them feel like they received justice? I know you see a lot of things, but if you could give us that top one or two things.
I'd say in pre-sentencing, so in a case where you get a conviction or a case where the offender is pleading guilty, the thing that I've heard more than once, so I'd say at least 2 or 3 times, is something to the effect of, that really felt sanitized, that victim impact statement really felt sanitized. And I think that the rules right now do tend to kind of tighten what the victim can say about their impact. And then there's also the concerns that we're advising them that they don't want to open potentially a door that's never been opened, that isn't relevant to consent or not. For example, mental health. That might not have been something that's ever come up, and we don't want to ruin the case We want the case to withstand appellate scrutiny so that the victim doesn't have to do this again. And so there's lots of considerations that go into that, and then that might be why the victim feels sanitized. But there's also case law that kind of restricts what the victim can say in pre-sentencing. So that's the thing that I've felt the worst about in representing victims, is that a few of them have said that at the end of the case.
And as far as justice and what my clients communicate, well, I preface this by saying I spend a great deal of time discussing with my client how the outcome of the case should not determine their sense of justice, and that a victory or a loss does not translate to their life. So I spend a lot of time on that. But what my clients are generally seeking is they want to know when is the accused going to give his side of the story. So I handle that early on, that he or she is probably not going to give his or her side of the story. So they want to know their side of the story. Second, I think they want an apology. And third, I hear from my clients that they want the offender to no longer be wearing a uniform regardless of what happens in the case. And I can't give all those things to my clients, but that's what they ask for.
I would piggyback on what my colleague from the Navy said as far as what my clients are seeking as far as justice. I always tell them that every step in the process is a victory. The fact that you report it, the fact that you got to the 32 charged, the fact there's 32 and so on, so that the actual guilty verdict, if there is one, it's just kind of like the cherry on the top. Because getting spun up and wound up and so focused on the outcome, you're going to be disappointed. Even if there's a guilty verdict, most of the time, sometimes it's disappointed because the accused did not get on the stand. Because piggyback on what she said, they want to hear his, and majority him, his side of the story. They want to hear that apology. And if there's an apology during sentencing, it's never good enough. So it's expectation management from the beginning. Focus on day by day. Take these little victories as they come. And the other thing I would say, a lot of things that they want that are not necessarily getting is consideration of their time, and the fact that this takes so much time and they've moved on, whether they're, in a sense, they moved on whether they're still in the service or not. They've moved on maybe personally. I've had clients get married, have babies, and it takes so long, and it can be extended periods of time between one action to the next, that every time they get that phone call from me asking for this or that, it's a disruption in their life. It's, we need you to come in or spend these next 4 hours on the phone with us. We need you to come in for this trial, and then the trial gets postponed. But they've already made all the arrangements for this particular week and time, and now they have to push off another month to 6 months. So I would say those are the big things that are issues for my clients.
Ma'am, I would echo the frustration with the amount of time that it takes. I hear that a lot from my clients. As far as just what do they want in addition to justice, I feel like a lot of my clients, they just want to be heard. They want the opportunity to be heard. And even in cases that don't have the outcome that they want, and that is certainly frustrating, I have found that they are happy that they went through the process and they had the opportunity to be heard.
I always ask my clients that question in the beginning, and probably the most common response is, I want him out, meaning they just want that accused to be out of the Coast Guard. They don't want to run, and so typically it's a male accused, so they don't want to run into him again. They don't want him to be in any other service or anything like that, in any circumstance where they can cross paths again. And it's funny, the last 3 written victims' views that I submitted, I specifically asked for what's called a code of RE4, which is a re-enlistment code of 4, which is a code that you give someone on their discharge papers that says they can't re-enlist in any service again. And when I tell my clients that that is something we can ask for, they tend to jump on that.
Thank you.
Great question. And then Judge Roll.
Thank you.
And then Mr. Kramer.
Thank you all. It's been very informative. We have something in California that passed a few years back called Marcy's Law, which provides for something similar, but not appointed, and you are provided a provided attorney for the complaining witness in a sexual assault case, and I think that's somewhat leveling of the playing field. Now, Captain Tedford, you indicated that abuse is not prevalent and that attorneys like yourselves act in good faith. So I'm going to ask a hypothetical and assume that in most cases this does not happen. If a complaining witness or victim tells you that it was a fabrication after she's made a report, assuming it's a woman, and she still wants the transfer, and she wants to get out because now she's kind of created a bubble of problems. Or it's not about the transfer, it's just about the case. Under those circumstances, what do you do? What is your role as victims' counsel and your role with the court? And if I could hear from whoever.
Yes, ma'am. I'll go first. So I think first it's important to note that I haven't had this experience in preparing for today. I talked with all of the other Air Force SVCs, and I have not heard of anyone having this experience. So I think that's very important to note up front. And then secondarily, we're all bound by our state bar rules as well as in the Air Force by the Air Force rules of professional conduct. And so if we know, under your hypothetical, we absolutely know because the client has told us that this was a fabrication, we cannot help the victim facilitate a fraud. I don't believe we have a duty to report to anyone because we're within the bounds of attorney-client privilege, but I would have to unfortunately tell the client that I could not continue to help them facilitate that fraud.
I would echo that, ma'am. I would look, depending on the facts you described, I would first look to my JAG instruction 5803.1 echo, which is our rules of professional responsibility, as well as my state rules. And those rules would point me to not being able to sponsor that lie, if that's a lie. So if that victim were going to take the stand and continue to lie, I would seek my supervisory attorney's permission to withdraw from that case, and that would be it.
In my experience, ma'am, I've never had a client outright say this was a fabrication. What I have seen is areas of gray and a lot of different perceptions about what the truth is. So when it doesn't hit those bar rules, from an officer's standpoint, from a JAG standpoint in my duties, to uphold our regulations, I advise the client on ways to limit their liability, which usually includes no longer participating in the process. So I do offer that advice to my clients if I believe that they're exposing themselves to further legal liability, either through a fraud or through some other misconduct that's out there, or some omission to law enforcement. I will provide advice either we need to take this to law enforcement and the client makes the decision. But my goal is to limit their legal liability. Whether they decide to continue to participate or not and it gets to those bar rules is another matter.
I would piggyback on what my colleague said as far as what they would do. I would say I have had 3 clients that it turned out their reports were false, but we never even got to the point where the accused was charged, because it became very clear during the investigation that they had made a false report. And in these particular cases, they were all civilians, so there was nothing that the military could do to them. So my firm belief is if someone's making a false report, it will be clear by the end of the investigation that it's a false report. Therefore, this particular individual is not going to be making a fraud upon the court, as it were. In the case if they had been military and they had requested an expedited transfer, that's kind of the risk you take with this program. But again, I don't think it would have gotten past the investigative stage. And I don't think any of my clients who did request an expedited transfer, those reports were false at all. I don't think the expedited transfer program is being abused in that way.
I guess a little bit of a different wrinkle on the hypothetical was just asked. You say that sometimes you're present during the interviews that the prosecutor has with the alleged victim. If the alleged victim says something during that discussion that you perceive to be exculpatory. The prosecutor does not, and so the prosecutor feels there's no obligation to disclose that, but you think it is. Do you have an obligation under those circumstances to disclose it?
No, sir.
Because it seems to me one of the problems you have is that if your role is a counselor, why do you need the prosecutor present? So if the prosecutor is present when that statement is made, does that alleviate the confidentiality of the statement?
Yes, sir. So as far as confidentiality, there is none. However, I don't have a duty under Giglio or Brady to turn over that. Now, what I will tell you in this situation is I would have two conversations. I would have one conversation with the prosecutor about why they need to turn this over, and we would have a stern heart-to-heart about following the rules. And then I would have a second conversation with my client about why it's in the benefit of her participation in going forward in this case to have that piece of information turned over to the defense. And so in the absence of good faith on the part of the prosecutor, I would probably urge my client to give me permission to turn that information over to the defense myself.
One other question. If there is a determination on a request for an expedited transfer denied, is that, and it's denied on the basis of there not being credible evidence of the allegation, is that determination admissible at a subsequent trial?
I don't know if it would be admissible, but I treat that kind of thing like I would anything that defense may take that's innocuous, I believe, and turn it into something that is not in order to make my client feel bad. And I think it would depend on exactly when that request was made and at what point in the investigation, because if the report was literally made 2 days ago, there's going to be credible information, but it may be more credible once there's been more of an investigation. So I think it really depends on the circumstances, but I don't think the fact that an expedited transfer was denied would have any bearing on the case, because again, defense takes a lot of things that are pretty innocuous and try to make them seem worse than they are, in my experience.
Your Honor, sir, I think the case law on this particular subject is evidence of prior sexual assaults is not admissible. However, evidence of prior false reports is going to be coming up on cross-examination for credibility purposes. However, this is going to get meted out during the pretrial motions, and the judge is going to make a determination beforehand whether or not the specific instances of that prior report actually rise to the level of a false report. And in some cases, the victim will be cross-examined on the stand about the prior knowledge of the expedited transfer process, why they requested the expedited transfer, and if they've had an expedited transfer before this case. And those things can come up on cross-examination, but there are limitations, and there's case law that talks specifically about that.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting. I have a two-part question and I completely understand Commander Markland's problem with running into the person all the time, which must be just terrible. So one thing I wonder is, since it's only for unrestricted reports, have you seen people change a restricted report to an unrestricted report just to take advantage of the expedited transfer process? And curious anecdote, I don't guess you probably don't have statistics, but anecdotally how often that happens. And the second question is bigger in the sense, we were given statistics, and as I said, I understand Commander Markland's, and it would seem to me to be terrible, but the numbers are actually pretty low of the percentage. I view it as low, maybe you view it as high, because it obviously causes a huge disruption in people's lives. But it varies from 10% in the Air Force, 13% in the Army, Marine Corps, 18%, but then 29% for the Navy, much, much higher. And I wonder why, to me, it seems very low, given the problems as described with having to run into the person all the time. And I just wonder why am I misreading it as low? Does it seem high to you?
Sir, can I just ask a clarification? That number, is that the number of expedited transfer requests?
unrestricted reports requesting expedited
Okay.
transfer in the Air Force was the lowest of all, 10%.
It's the percentage of unrestricted reports of people who have then asked for an expedited
Yes, ma'am.
transfer.
Yep.
I think there's so many factors that go into a victim's choice to submit an expedited transfer that it's too hard to capture why one service is higher than another, because there could be so much going on in each particular victim's life that it might just be, the way it is. But I think that those numbers are actually low in comparison to out of our clients, at least for me, about 25 to, about 20 to 30% of my clients ask for an expedited transfer. So it's pretty close to what you said about the Marine Corps number. So that's pretty accurate, I think. But going back to your first question, sir, restricted to unrestricted, I have not seen a victim, at least anecdotally, that went restricted to unrestricted just to get an expedited transfer. I've actually seen a restricted case that got an unwritten expedited transfer. So there's creative ways to, if the victim does not want to report, that's on, the VLC or SVC to kind of figure that out. But I have not seen that yet. I think it goes back to there's probably a perception out there that's frankly unwarranted, because the exceptional case tends to pollute people's minds that people are unrestricting so that they can go somewhere better. I hope that answers your question, sir.
Would you all concur anecdotally that you have not seen that move?
I have seen that.
You have seen them?
I have, and I've advised clients to make that choice for their best interest. A client can unrestrict their case, submit their expedited transfer request, and simultaneously sign a document declining to participate with law enforcement. It's for private, it's for all number of reasons, but for their privacy. And I've seen it in our regular active duty services and also in our academy.
And do you have a feel for why the Navy's percentage is so much higher?
Sir, I would be speculating.
Okay.
I would say, in my experience, most of the clients that made restricted reports are unrestricted. They're unrestricting their report not for expedited transfer, but for some other reason. And I would say why their percentage is low as far as people asking for expedited transfer is because some of clients are married to other service members, or they're married to civilians who have jobs in the area. Maybe their support system in this area, or maybe they just don't want another major event in their life, so they're choosing to stay. It could be that they do have a supportive unit. There could be their unit, they are not experiencing retaliation, they're not experiencing any rumors, or the good with the unit outweighs the bad. So I would think could be some reasons why the percentage are so low.
Thank you.
I would concur with both. I have seen where a case is restricted and then goes unrestricted and asks for the expedited transfer program, but then also does not participate in the military justice process, and that frankly was the case that was the right decision that client made for herself. The 10% number, my numbers are a little bit higher. I've had 37 clients and 9 have taken advantage of the expedited transfer program, which is about 24.3%. And I would echo my colleagues that these are complex decisions that complex humans are making in every case.
Dean Harrison. Sorry.
I was saying, for my clients, I haven't had any who went unrestricted to take advantage of expedited transfers. But what happens is what they want is justice, and so they take advantage of going unrestricted for that purpose. And then when the MCIOs start investigating, that's when everything breaks loose at the command, and then they want the expedited transfer because it's a little bit too much of what's going on at the command, because everyone knows at that point. So one kind of begets the other. And then I think a lot of the reasons, because like you said, in the Coast Guard, everywhere small, you'll run into them all the time. But I think the commands are moving the accused. A lot of times they've already moved the accused before I've gotten involved. So that's why those folks aren't asking for expedited, because they're still not going to run into them, but they don't need the expedited transfer to accomplish that.
First, I'd like to thank all of you for what you're doing. It sounds like it's really a tremendous step forward. for all of the services. But I've got two questions. As I read the DoD regs, it sounds like there is a presumption for granting a request for an expedited transfer. But as I listen to each of you, and this might just because you're really good lawyers, you approach these cases as if you have to prove that your client's case should be granted. Should I assume that the commands do not always approach this as something where the victim should be presumed to be given an expedited transfer? I know you're just basing this on your own experiences.
Yes, sir,
and
exactly. This is my opinion, not the opinion of the Navy. But yes, my perception and my experience is that commanders, there is a higher bar, and we do have to provide a certain amount of information for that commander to believe that they are making a decision that meets the regulation.
I think it depends on the commander, it depends on the victim. The case that I ran into a couple roadblocks with, there were some other things going on in the victim's life, and the commander was not co-located with that victim because that victim, the 06 level commander, is located way far away. It's a reserve unit, so way far away from where so he doesn't personally know the victim. So I think, again, it depends on the commander, it depends on the victim. That's on us, that's on the Sapper program to advocate on behalf of that victim, so that commander who doesn't know the victim very well knows that story. But I've had very good luck for the most part, sir. Commanders are very receptive, at least the commanders I've interacted with, to granting that request, and it happens fast. Like I think Commander Markland, you mentioned, I mean, I've seen a victim submit a request and the same day get orders, and she's got to be gone within the week. So she was very excited though, so it worked out.
Sir, I would echo that. I found commanders to be very receptive. I found them that they're concerned about our clients. They want to make sure the clients have fully thought through the decision, and there's a warm handoff to the next commander. But I found generally that they have followed the presumption. I think the SVCs and the Sarcs have to walk them through, especially if they haven't, even though they've had the training, if they haven't done an expedited transfer before, it's sometimes a foreign concept, and so we have to walk them through. But I have found that they follow the presumption.
My perspective of the Coast Guard commanders has been that they don't have a presumption one way or the other. They just want to do the right thing, whatever that is. So when I send my requests, I do two things. I send them a copy of the policy, which is pretty short and easy to understand, and then I also, at the bottom right, call your servicing legal office, because I know as a former SJA, they'll forget to do that sometimes. So, and then the legal office will guide them through the process. But otherwise, I'm not sure they have a bias one way or another. That they just want to know what they should do.
And some commanders call us,
right,
as though we're their SJAs.
Right.
Anything different in the Army?
No, I would agree that most commanders want to do the right thing, and most of the time I'm not getting the calls. They are calling their trial counsel and asking those questions, and I may hear about it through the trial counsel. But I think it's really going to depend on the commander, how much effort you're putting in on the front end, because if you have a new commander, you may have to put in more effort on the front end because this is perhaps their first one, and if you have a commander who's in their second year, then you already know what you have to do for that particular commander. But I think most commanders are wanting to do the right thing and take care of the soldier, and make sure they're following the rules.
My last question, it sounds like for some of you this is a major part of your assignment. For some of you it's a collateral duty maybe. As lawyers in your services, is an assignment like this looked upon beneficially for your career advancement, or neutrally, or?
I would say in the Army, it depends on the installation, whether or not it's going to be a full-time or part-time duty. I personally think it should be full-time, no matter where you are. And I personally think, just like a lot of things in the Army, you may not have enough bodies for the new mission that you have to do. So I think some installations don't have enough SVCs. So bigger installations end up taking a lot more clients. So at Fort Hood, like it was said earlier, we get a lot of clients in for expedited transfers, and some of them want a SVC that's on the ground. So we end up taking a lot of more cases than another installation, because we just have 4 full-time SVCs. I think with any new job in any of the services, people are going to have questions of whether or not this is going to be good for your career. I never had any of those questions. My philosophy is the Army tells me I have to do this, I'm going to do it. So I don't worry about whether that's going to have a bad impact on my career or not. And in my experience, without even being having asked someone about that, I've been told don't worry about it. Even though I never had those worries, but I've been told don't worry about it. And I think that has borne out in my experience thus far.
In the Navy, sir, the Victims Legal Counsel program, in my opinion, is looked on highly. From anecdotally, we've had good promotion rates. However, that could be because we're also personally screened by our judge advocate before we're placed in this position. I have direct reach back to my deputy chief of staff and my chief of staff of the program, and they check on me pretty often on my my personal well-being as well, because this job has some stresses that are unusual for trial positions. So I do think that the program and the position is looked on highly by my service. And while it's a newer job in the JAG Corps, there are metrics and also reach back in place to make sure that we're all doing well.
Sir, I just want to start off by saying it is a sole duty in the Marine Corps to be a VLC. We are screened, like the Navy, not only by the OIC of the Victims Legal Counsel. Those individuals identified and nominated to that person are then screened by that person through an interview process, and then they're certified by the SGA to the Commandant. So there is a screening process even to become a VLC. And I would say that it's still a mixed bag in the Marine Corps. I think that there's probably a good number of people, especially amongst the younger judge advocates, that really want to do it. But I think that there's still folks who think that it's this three-headed beast that's now entered the courtroom. But I think we're getting past that, and we're doing well anecdotally on promotion boards and school boards. And so I think that more and more as the younger folks see that they're, the old geezers like me are moving up and we're hanging in there.
What does that make us?
I think as they see that, then I think that it'll continue to produce. We're very lucky. We have very good people across the board, and I think that as the practice has grown over the last 4 years, we continue to get better and better counsel coming in, and people are volunteering more and more. But we're not quite where the total stigma that VLC could be damaging to your career is gone yet. So, thank you, sir.
Yes, so I found in the Air Force that, well, first, let me say it is a full-time position, so these are my sole duties, and I found that it is looked at as beneficial. You have to be nominated. So for me, I was in the legal office at my base before. I was nominated by my SJA for this job, and then there is a formal vetting process as well. I think it's looked at beneficially for a couple of reasons, but for junior JAGs, like myself, I was in the legal office for 2 years before I moved over to this job. And in this job, I have been given the opportunity to run my own office. I have my own paralegal, and you have you're given a certain degree of leadership and autonomy that captains don't normally get.
All I have for you is my personal observation, which is just that the folks that are doing this work are getting promoted.
Thank you.
All right. Ms. Garvin, and then I think we're pretty much out of time.
So jumping off of what Jennifer Long had asked, kind of a broader question, since I'm not sure when we're going to have you back. Major Martz, you brought up that Article 6B is broader than 412 and 513, but so much of your practice has been seemingly constrained to 412 and 513. So I'm just curious how much you guys are arguing general 6B practice, and then what you feel about your capacity to challenge losses of your motion practice on 6B.
So actually with the help of probably you, Ms. Garvin, and Lisa Krieger-Norman, and all of us get together and we talk out these issues, I think the next charge for us is, and I'm stealing the Air Force's thunder here because I'm totally stealing this from them, is the next charge is Article 6B, right to be free from a reasonable delay, going back to the complaint that's been highlighted about the victims. It drives us and them crazy that it takes so long. So anytime a defense counsel files a continuance motion, then there's a good chance we might be fighting it, because they don't want to have that phone call where we're saying, all right, it was supposed to happen in January, now it's happening in April. They want to get this over with. So that's one area that I think we're seeing some more motions practice. The other area that we're seeing, at least within the Marine Corps, is seeking those protective orders over certain types of evidence, going back to what's discoverable versus what's produced. I mean, we talked about discover admissibility, but discovery versus production. You know, a SAMFI kit and photos and mental health records and medical records and cell phone data, you know, that all could be an area that we are seeking protective orders over from either the convening authority if it's early on, or the military judge under Article 6B out of our client, again, going back to the right to be treated with fairness and dignity and respect of their privacy. So.
Yes, ma'am. We are arguing Article 6B. I will echo everything that Major Mart said, to include the issues or the motions that are not 412 or 513. The judges are wanting to hear us make a standing argument first, and so we're having to fight to even get a foot in the door. But we are making those motions.
I am so ready to stand up and make an Article 6B argument. And that was the one thing when Article 6B came out. I said, "This is it. This is what has been concerning me," you know, because even I have had opportunity to disrespect a sexual assault victim when I was defending and things like that. And what I'm learning now, which I didn't expect, was that defense counsel are now figuring out how to deconstruct a complaining witness's credibility without taking away their dignity. And so I haven't had to stand up on that yet.
I'd say in my practice, the majority of the motions we had were around 412 and 513, so haven't had an opportunity to really argue 6B, but the program since the SVC program since its inception has been very supportive of SVCs pushing the limits of what they can do. So I'm sure other SVCs may have had to argue 6B and, you know, would have called their colleagues in other services for advice because, like, the Air Force is leading the way.
And I have nothing to add on that point, ma'am.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Commander Markland, Captain Tedford, Major Martz, Lieutenant Commander Huffstetler, and Major Jack. We really appreciate you coming. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Captain Tideswell, have there been any last-minute requests for public comment?
No, Mayor, there have not.
Then, Mr. Sullivan?
This public meeting is officially closed.